The Alpha's captive heart. After a failed rebellion leaves her pack broken and vulnerable, gentle outcast, Lira is handed over to Kalen, the ruthless alpha of their rival clan. As tension and passion ignite between them, Lira discovers that beneath his savage exterior lies a man haunted by his past. But with danger closing in, can she survive loving the monster who holds her captive? Chapter 1. Taken to the wolf's den. The scent of blood still clung to the air. Lira walked barefoot over the forest floor, her steps muffled by fallen leaves, but weighted by dread. Her wrists were bound in front of her with coarse rope, chafing against her skin with every hesitant movement. 2 warriors from Kalen's pack flanked her, their presence as imposing as the towering pines around them. Neither spoke, and Lira kept her eyes lowered, trying to mask the tremble in her legs. Her heart pounded with every step that took her further from the remnants of her pack, the home she once knew. She had watched it fall mere hours ago beneath the claws and fangs of Kalen's wolves. The rebellion had been doomed from the start, but desperation drove her kin to the edge, urging them to challenge a rival alpha who was stronger, faster, and merciless in his pursuit of dominance. The night it all ended still replayed in her mind. Her father, proud and fierce, stood with the other elders as they made their final stand. Lira was never meant to witness the bloodshed, but when the howls broke through the walls of her home, she had slipped out. She saw it all, the swift, brutal efficiency of Kalen's pack as they cut through her people like wildfire in dry grass. And now she walked alone toward his den, traded like a piece of livestock in the aftermath. Why hers? Marcus had asked when Kalen made the demand. The beta's voice was laced with confusion, but never outright defied his alpha. Because she's the last piece left, Kalen had replied, his expression unreadable. The rest have been broken or scattered. Let them know even the quiet ones aren't untouchable. Lira knew she was no warrior. She had no standing in the hierarchy. She healed wounds, gathered herbs, and kept to the fringes during conflicts. Her father called her soft, meant as both a compliment and a lament. In the eyes of her pack, she was fragile, and in the eyes of Kalen, she was insignificant enough to use as a pawn. The cold air bit into her skin as the sun began to sink beneath the treetops. Kalen's stronghold wasn't far now. Lira could see the faint glow of torches flickering in the distance, illuminating the path ahead. One of the wolves beside her, a broad-shouldered man with thick brown hair, glanced at her for the first time. His gaze lingered, heavy and unreadable. "You'll want to keep your head down when we arrive," he muttered. Lira didn't respond, but she nodded faintly. She had no intention of drawing attention. The trees thinned, revealing the edges of the den's territory. Built into the side of a large cliff, the structure was a blend of stone and wood, with narrow watchtowers peering over the expanse of forest like silent sentinels. Torches lined the perimeter, and she could make out the silhouettes of wolves standing guard at various posts. They entered through a large gate, the iron creaking as it swung open. Kalen's pack moved within the courtyard, some sharpening weapons, others hauling supplies. Lira felt the weight of their stares almost immediately. "Is that her?" someone whispered. "She doesn't look like much," another replied. Lira kept walking, but her head dipped lower. The heat of humiliation pooled in her chest. She didn't need to see their faces to know they were judging her, fragile and small in a place that valued strength above all else. At the far end of the courtyard, Kalen stood waiting. His figure was stark against the torchlight, his black clothing blending with the shadows behind him. He was tall, lean, and sharp in a way that felt dangerous even from a distance. The moonlight reflected off his dark hair, and his piercing gaze met hers as she was led toward him. The wolves on either side of her stopped, but Lira kept walking until she stood just a few feet away. The tension in the air thickened, but she didn't dare raise her eyes. "So, this is the healer they sent me," Kalen said, his voice smooth but cold. Lira remained silent, unsure if she was allowed to speak. "I expected something more defiant," he continued, circling her slowly. "Most tributes spit curses, swear vengeance. But you're trembling." Her breath hitched, and for a fleeting moment, She felt shame burning beneath her skin. "Look at me," Kalen ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lira hesitated before finally lifting her gaze. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she saw him up close. The angular planes of his face, the faint scar along his jawline, and the sharp intensity that seemed to peel away any defenses she tried to muster. He tilted his head, as if searching for something within her. "I could send you back in pieces," he mused, his expression unreadable. "Would your pack come for you, I wonder? Or would they leave you to rot in our dungeons?" Lira swallowed thickly, her heart pounding so loudly she feared he could hear it. I don't know," she admitted softly. The corner of Kalen's mouth curved, not a smile, but something darker, more dangerous.
"Honest."
"I wasn't expecting that," he said, stepping closer until she could feel the heat of his presence. For a brief, terrible moment, she thought he might strike her, or worse. But instead, he simply leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. "Don't mistake my mercy for kindness," he warned. "I let you live because it amuses me. Step out of line, and I'll remind you why they fear me." Lyra's breath caught, but she nodded. Satisfied, Kalen stepped back, signaling to one of the guards. "Take her to the east wing. She can have the empty room near the kitchens," he said dismissively. "Keep her in line, but don't damage her. She's mine now." Lyra's stomach twisted at the finality in his words. She was no longer free. Not even a person, but a possession in the eyes of the Alpha. As the guard led her away, she felt the weight of Kalen's gaze following her, burning into her back long after she disappeared into the shadows of the stronghold. The stone corridor swallowed Lira in silence, save for the faint echo of her footsteps. The guard leading her down the hall kept a brisk pace, not bothering to check if she followed. The iron sconces lining the walls flickered with torchlight, casting long shadows that danced like specters on the cold surfaces. Lyra's heart thudded steadily, her hands tightening around the frayed rope still binding her wrists. She hadn't expected kindness here. Kalen's words had made that clear, but she hadn't imagined the overwhelming sense of isolation that pressed down on her like a heavy cloak. The stronghold was nothing like her former home. Her pack's den, nestled deep within the woods, had been vibrant with life, the stone walls warmed by flickering hearths and the soft hum of familial bonds. Here, the walls seemed to breathe ice, and the air crackled with restrained aggression. Kalen's wolves watched her with expressions that wavered between curiosity and disdain, yet none made a move to approach.
She knew why.
She belonged to Kalen now. "Keep up," the guard snapped over his shoulder. He was taller than most, his build compact but muscular beneath the leather armor stretched across his chest. His hair hung loosely over his brow, and although his eyes lacked the cruel gleam Lira expected, there was no warmth in his tone. Lira hastened her steps to match his, suppressing the questions burning at the tip of her tongue. Would she be allowed to leave this room? Would she ever see the outside of this fortress again? Would Kalen summon her like a servant? Or would he forget she existed altogether? "Where is everyone?" Lira finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The guard didn't answer immediately. He rounded a corner, leading her deeper into the east wing, before casting a glance her way. "Most of the pack is out patrolling or handling border disputes," he said gruffly. "The rest don't make a habit of lingering down here." "Why not?" His lips twitched in something that almost resembled a smile. "Because this wing used to be a prison." Lyra's steps faltered. She froze, staring at the damp walls that now seemed to close in tighter around her. "It's not anymore," the guard added quickly, noticing her reaction. "Kalen had it converted when he took over. Said he didn't want prisoners rotting under his roof." His words should have been comforting, but the unease still knotted itself around her chest. A few moments later, the guard stopped outside a weathered wooden door. He pulled out a ring of keys, selecting one before sliding it into the lock. The door groaned in protest as it swung inward, revealing a small but clean room within. A simple bed pushed against the wall, a wooden table, and a narrow window overlooking the distant forest. "This is it," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. Lira crossed the threshold hesitantly, her eyes sweeping the sparse space. "It's more than I expected," she admitted truthfully. The guard arched a brow. "Expecting a cage?" She didn't respond, but the guarded flicker in her eyes was answer enough. "I'll leave you to it," he said, stepping back into the hall. Kalen's orders were clear. No one is to bother you unless he says otherwise. As he turned to leave, Lira found her voice. "Wait," she said softly. "What's your name?" The guard hesitated, glancing at her over his shoulder. "Darian," he answered after a beat. "I'll be around if you need something." Before she could reply, the door clicked shut behind him, leaving Lira alone in the dimly lit room. Lira lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, the rope around her wrists rubbing against her skin with each movement. The weight of exhaustion settled over her, but her mind refused to still. She let out a shaky breath, staring at the small window. The moon hung low in the sky, bathing the treetops in pale silver light. Somewhere out there, the remnants of her pack wandered, displaced, scattered. She wondered if they thought of her, if they would ever come to reclaim her. But deep down, she knew the truth. No one was coming. Kalen had made sure of that. Her thoughts drifted to the Alpha himself, the way he circled her like a predator sizing up prey. There was a cold, dangerous intensity in his gaze that unnerved her, but beneath it, Lira sensed something else. He had let her live. A man like Kalen didn't keep captives without reason. Whatever his motive, she doubted it was born of mercy. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch as the hours bled into the night. Lira sat in silence, the faint crackle of torches in the hall the only sound accompanying her. Her hand brushed over her wrists, wincing at the chafed skin beneath the rope. After a moment's hesitation, she rose and approached the small table. A crude iron knife lay atop it, likely left behind by someone who previously occupied the room. With careful hands, she began to saw at the rope, the rough blade biting into the fibers. She had just managed to free one wrist when a soft knock echoed at the door. Lira froze, her pulse quickening. "It's me," Darian's voice filtered through the wood. "I brought food." Relief flooded her chest. She placed the knife down, quickly brushing stray strands of hair from her face before opening the door. Darian stood with a wooden tray in hand, the scent of roasted meat and bread drifting toward her. "You didn't have to," Lira murmured, stepping aside to let him in. Kalen ordered it. Darian set the tray down, his gaze briefly flicking to her partially cut bindings. His expression remained unreadable. Lira caught the glance and shifted uncomfortably. "I was going to ask someone to—" "I don't care," Darian interrupted, leaning against the wall. "You're not the first to try cutting yourself loose. Just know this. If Kalen sees you without those ropes, he'll assume you're planning to run. And that's not something you want to make him believe." Lira swallowed hard. "I'm not planning anything," she said quietly. Darian studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Eat," he said, pushing the tray toward her. "You'll need your strength." "For what?" His gaze darkened faintly. "Surviving him." Without another word, Darian left, leaving Lira alone once more, her untouched meal and the weight of his warning lingering heavily in the air. Chapter 2: The Wolf in the Shadows. The following days blurred together in a haze of isolation and uneasy silence. Lira spent most of her time confined to the small room in the East Wing, the cold stone walls pressing in around her. The quiet might have been comforting under different circumstances, but here it felt suffocating. The only break in the monotony came in the form of brief visits from Darian, who brought her meals and little else. Kalen did not summon her. Lira wasn't sure if that should comfort or unsettle her. She had expected some form of confrontation, perhaps an interrogation or further humiliation. Yet, aside from their initial meeting in the courtyard, the Alpha kept his distance. It was as if he had forgotten she existed. Her eyes drifted toward the narrow window, where the pale glow of the moon filtered in. The forest beyond seemed vast and untamed, calling to her in ways she couldn't explain. She wondered if she could slip away beneath the cover of night, but Darian's warning echoed in her mind. "If Kalen sees you without those ropes, he'll assume you're planning to run." Lira exhaled softly, running her fingers along the partially cut rope still loosely hanging from her wrists. Even if she wanted to flee, she knew the likelihood of escaping unnoticed was slim. This wasn't her forest. Every twist of the trees, every uneven path belonged to Kalen's wolves. They would catch her scent long before she reached the borders. And then there was Kalen himself. Lira had heard the stories, how he tore apart rebels with his bare hands, how entire packs had fallen beneath his wrath. Yet, when she recalled the way he had looked at her that night in the courtyard, there had been something else. Curiosity. Kalen was not a man driven by impulse. Every action he took felt deliberate, as if he were constantly calculating 3 steps ahead. That thought terrified her more than any threat of violence. A faint knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She stiffened, expecting Darian's familiar voice. But instead, the door creaked open without invitation. Kalen stood in the doorway. Lira immediately rose to her feet, unsure of the proper etiquette. Her heart hammered as she lowered her gaze, gripping the edge of the wooden table for support. The Alpha's presence filled the room like a storm cloud rolling in, suffocating in its intensity. He leaned casually against the frame, arms crossed over his chest as he regarded her with those piercing eyes. "You've been quiet," Kalen remarked, his voice low and smooth. Lira swallowed, unsure if he expected a response. "I wasn't sure if I was allowed to roam," she admitted carefully. Kalen arched a brow, stepping further into the room.
"Smart," he said.
"But not why I'm here." Lira's stomach twisted in anticipation. "I have a proposition," Kalen continued, circling the small space like a wolf stalking prey. "Your people tried to overthrow me, and while I crushed their rebellion, there are still loose ends that need tying." Lira stiffened, dread pooling in her chest. "If you expect me to betray them, I expect you to survive," Kalen interrupted sharply, his eyes narrowing. "If that requires betrayal, then so be it." Lira's gaze flickered toward the window, as if the forest beyond might somehow shield her from his scrutiny. "What do you want from me?" she asked softly. Kalen stopped mere inches away, his presence overwhelming. "I want to know why they trusted you," he said, tilting his head as if inspecting her. "Your father led that rebellion, and yet they offered you to me without hesitation." Lira's breath caught in her throat. They didn't have a choice," she whispered. Kalen's gaze lingered, and for a brief moment, Lira thought she saw something flicker beneath the surface, something almost human. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "You may not see it yet," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a near growl. "But you're valuable, Lira."
"More than you realize."
His words left her cold. Kalen stepped back, as if satisfied with the tension he had created. "You can leave this room," he announced abruptly. "But stray too far, and my wolves will drag you back." "I won't stop them." Lira hesitated. "Why are you letting me out now?" Kalen's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because watching you cower is becoming dull." Without another word, he turned and disappeared down the corridor, leaving Lira standing in the dim light of her room, pulse racing. The next morning, Lira ventured cautiously beyond the east wing. The fortress was larger than she had imagined, with stone hallways that twisted and turned like the veins of some great beast. She passed a few wolves along the way, their eyes narrowing as she walked by, but none approached her. Her steps eventually led her to the courtyard where it had all begun. The cool morning air kissed her skin as she stepped outside, and for the first time since her capture, Lira felt something resembling peace. The scent of pine lingered, and the faint chirping of distant birds filled the silence. Lira's fingers brushed against the rope on her wrists. It felt wrong to stand there beneath the open sky, as if the freedom was nothing more than an illusion. "I didn't think you'd leave your room," Darian's voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find him leaning against one of the stone pillars, arms folded as he watched her with mild curiosity. "I thought I wasn't allowed to," Lira replied. Darian shrugged. "You're allowed. Kalen enjoys pushing boundaries, even if it confuses the rest of us." Lira frowned. "Does he do this often?" Darian's expression darkened slightly.
"No."
"You're the first guest he's ever kept." Lira stiffened at the implication. You make it sound like I should be worried. Darian met her gaze, his eyes unreadable. You should be. Lira spent the rest of the day exploring the fortress grounds cautiously, never straying too far from the courtyard. Wolves trained in the fields, their howls echoing in the distance, but she avoided lingering near them. As evening approached, Lira returned to her room, expecting the silence to swallow her once again. But Kalen was waiting inside. He sat at the table, his sharp gaze fixing on her the moment she entered. "You're not as fragile as I thought," he remarked. Lyra's hands tightened around the doorframe. "I'm not fragile," she said quietly. Kalen's lips twitched. "Good," he said. "Because fragile things tend to break around me." Lyra's pulse quickened as Kalen's words lingered in the air. The small room suddenly felt even smaller with him occupying the space, his presence heavy and unmistakable. He hadn't moved from the chair, one arm resting casually along the table's edge, yet every fiber of his being radiated dominance. Lira hesitated near the door, unsure whether to step further inside or retreat. Her hand hovered over the doorframe, fingers curling tightly around the rough wood as if it could somehow shield her from the growing tension. But Kalen's eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unrelenting, making it clear that escape wasn't an option. "I didn't expect to find you here," Lira said softly, treading carefully around the undercurrent in his tone. Kalen's gaze narrowed, the faintest flicker of amusement dancing in his otherwise cold expression. "I wanted to see how far you'd go." Lira frowned. "I wasn't trying to go anywhere." "Not yet," Kalen replied smoothly. "But you will. They always do." A chill crept down her spine. "I don't plan to run," she said firmly. "Everyone plans to stay until they see the monster." Lyra's eyes softened slightly as she studied him. There was something behind those words, something hidden beneath the carefully constructed walls Kalen wore like armor. "I don't think you're the monster you pretend to be," Lira murmured. The room grew eerily quiet, as if the very walls held their breath. Kalen's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening. For the briefest moment, she thought she had crossed some invisible line, but instead of anger, Kalen leaned forward, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "You're either brave or foolish," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Maybe both." Lira lowered her gaze, swallowing the knot forming in her throat. "Or maybe I'm just honest," she replied carefully. Silence stretched between them, and for a fleeting moment, Lira wondered if he would dismiss her. But instead, Kalen rose from the chair in a slow, fluid motion, his boots making soft echoes against the stone floor. He crossed the room until he stood directly before her, looming in the narrow space between them. "Tell me, Lira," he murmured, his voice dropping like a whisper of wind against her skin. "Do you know what happens to prey when it lingers too long in the wolf's den?" Lyra's heart raced, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "The prey either runs," she began softly, "or learns to live among the wolves." Kalen's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but instead of responding, he stepped back, granting her the smallest reprieve. "You'll have the chance to prove that," he said, his tone neutral once more. "Tomorrow, I want you to come to the courtyard." Lyra's brow furrowed. "Why?" Kalen smiled faintly, but it wasn't comforting. "Because I need to know if you belong here, or if I should have left you with the rebels." The weight of his words pressed heavily on her chest. "What if I don't pass your test?" Lira asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kalen's gaze lingered on her for a long moment. "Then you won't need to worry about surviving for long." Lira didn't sleep that night. She lay in the small bed, her eyes tracing the cracks along the ceiling as the soft glow of moonlight filtered through the narrow window. Kalen's words repeated in her mind, a constant reminder that her future in the pack was anything but certain. Survival was a fragile thing, and in Kalen's world, fragility was a weakness that rarely lasted. By the time dawn crept over the fortress, Lira had already risen. She dressed in the simple tunic and leggings left for her and tied back her hair, ensuring nothing would obstruct her vision. If she was to face whatever test Kalen had in store, she wouldn't meet it unprepared. When she stepped outside, the courtyard was already bustling with activity. Wolves sparred in the open field, their movements sharp and calculated, while others gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Lyra's presence drew subtle but unmistakable attention. Whispers drifted around her like the wind, but she ignored them, focusing instead on the figure standing near the training grounds. Kalen. He stood with Darien, observing the sparring matches unfolding before them. Lira approached cautiously, her steps light against the cobblestones. Kalen, she greeted softly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty bubbling beneath her skin. The alpha's gaze slid toward her, his eyes narrowing with faint approval. You came, he said simply, as if her presence was expected but not guaranteed. I didn't think I had much of a choice, Lira replied carefully. Kalen's lips twitched. Smart. He stepped forward, gesturing toward the open field where several of his wolves circled, waiting for their turn to spar. Join them, Kalen instructed. Lyra's eyes widened slightly. I'm not a fighter, she admitted. Kalen's gaze sharpened. You don't need to be. But I need to see how you respond under pressure. Her pulse quickened, but she nodded without protest. The other wolves shifted uneasily as she entered the circle, their eyes filled with doubt. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with dark hair and piercing green eyes, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. I'll make this quick, he said with a smirk. Lira swallowed, steeling herself as she faced him. The moment the fight began, it was clear she was outmatched. The wolf lunged, his movements swift and deliberate, but Lira twisted to avoid the brunt of the blow, narrowly dodging his fist. Her instincts took over. She wasn't strong, but she was fast. Each time he advanced, she slipped just out of reach, using his weight against him. The match wasn't elegant, but it became a dance of endurance, one she refused to lose. When the wolf finally stumbled, breath ragged and frustration burning in his eyes, Kalen stepped forward. Enough, he ordered. The wolf hesitated but ultimately stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. Lira remained standing, heart pounding as Kalen's gaze swept over her. You may not be a fighter, he said quietly, but you learn quickly. Lira met his eyes, unsure if the faint praise was genuine or merely a test in itself. Kalen approached, lowering his voice, so only she could hear. Remember this, Lira, he murmured. Survival here isn't about strength. It's about knowing which battles to fight and when to run. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Lira standing in the circle, breathless but unbroken. Chapter 3. The Chains Beneath the Skin. Lyra's muscles ached by the time she returned to her room, the remnants of the sparring match clinging to her like a second skin. Every breath felt heavier, as if the weight of the morning's events pressed down on her chest, reminding her how close she had danced to the edge. The other wolves had watched her like a curiosity, an outsider weaving through their ranks. She could feel the disdain rippling beneath their guarded stares, though none dared speak it aloud in Kalen's presence. To them, she was nothing more than a fragile piece of broken glass, handed to their alpha as spoils of war. But fragile things could cut deep if handled improperly. Lira lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, gingerly touching the bruise forming along her side, where the wolf's blow had glanced off her ribs. She had been lucky to escape the match with nothing worse, but luck wouldn't shield her forever. She exhaled softly, fingers tightening against the fabric of her tunic. Why am I here? The question had circled her mind for days, but Kalen's motives remained a tangled snare she couldn't unravel. Keeping her alive served no political purpose. Her pack had already been shattered, their rebellion quelled. She held no power, no leverage that might sway an alpha's decisions. And yet, Kalen watched her as if expecting something more, something she couldn't yet see. A soft knock at the door broke her from her thoughts. Lira rose cautiously, cracking the door open just enough to meet Darien's gaze. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed casually over his chest. Relax, he said, catching the wariness in her eyes. I'm not here to drag you into another fight. Lira opened the door fully, stepping aside to let him in. I didn't think you were, she admitted, though the tension in her shoulders hadn't fully eased. Darien surveyed the room briefly, before his eyes settled on her bruised ribs. "I see the morning wasn't entirely kind to you," he remarked, arching a brow. Lira shrugged. "I'm still standing." "Barely." Darian smirked, though his tone carried the faintest trace of approval. Lira sank back onto the bed, resting her hands on her lap. "Why did he make me fight?" Darian's expression shifted, the light humor fading into something heavier. "Kalen doesn't keep people around without reason," he said simply. "He wanted to see if you'd break. And if I had?" Darian met her gaze, his eyes darkening slightly. "Then you wouldn't be having this conversation." The weight of his words settled between them like a stone. "I know it doesn't make sense," Darian continued, sensing her unspoken question. "Kalen's not the type to take prisoners, let alone keep them under his protection." Lira frowned. "Protection? Is that what this is?" Darian's lips curved faintly, but there was no humor in the gesture. "You may not see it, but keeping you here, under his watch, is safer than leaving you out there." His gaze drifted toward the window, where the dark line of the forest stretched endlessly beyond the stronghold's walls. "The others," Lira said carefully, "they don't seem to share his views." "They don't," Darian admitted. "To them, you're just another reminder of the rebellion. The longer you're here, the more restless they'll become." Lira's stomach twisted uneasily. "Then why not send me away?" Darian hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly before he answered. "Because Kalen sees something in you," he said quietly. "And whether you realize it or not, that makes you valuable." Lira's fingers instinctively brushed over the faint rope burns still lining her wrists. "I'm not sure if that's comforting," she murmured. "It shouldn't be." Darian's voice softened, but his eyes remained sharp. "Stay out of their way," he advised. "The others might not act while Kalen's watching, but if you give them a reason, they won't hesitate." Lira met his gaze, nodding faintly. "I'll be careful." Darian lingered a moment longer before pushing away from the wall. "Good," he said, stepping toward the door. "Because if you're not, even Kalen won't save you from them." The door closed softly behind him, but the echo of his warning lingered long after his footsteps faded down the corridor. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Lira had memorized nearly every crack and crevice in the stone walls. Her mind churned with unrelenting questions, each one circling back to the same inevitable conclusion. Survival here wasn't just about keeping her head down. It was about understanding the power that flowed through this fortress. And Kalen held all of it in his hands. Nightfall blanketed the stronghold in cold silence. Lira lay beneath the thin blanket, eyes half-lidded as the faint flicker of torchlight seeped beneath the cracks of her door. The air carried the distant howls of wolves patrolling the outer perimeter, but within the fortress walls, everything remained still. Until it wasn't. The soft creak of her door sent a jolt through her chest. Lira's body stiffened, her fingers curling instinctively around the handle of the small iron knife she kept beneath the pillow, a habit born from necessity rather than paranoia. The door opened just enough to reveal Kalen's silhouette. His eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light, catching the faint sliver of the moon through her window. "You're awake," Kalen said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Lira sat up slowly, keeping the knife hidden beneath the blanket. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted carefully. Kalen's gaze drifted over her, lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Walk with me," he said, leaving no room for refusal. Lira hesitated but rose without protest, trailing behind him as they moved through the quiet corridors. The fortress felt different under the cover of darkness, the usual buzz of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. "Where are we going?" Lira asked softly, her voice barely louder than the sound of her footsteps. Kalen didn't answer immediately. When they emerged into the open courtyard, Lira's breath caught faintly at the sight before her. The sky stretched wide and endless, the stars scattered like fragments of shattered glass across a canvas of midnight blue. The cool breeze brushed against her skin, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and smoke. "I didn't think you were the type to admire the stars," Lira said, breaking the silence. Kalen's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "There are things even an alpha can't control," he murmured. His words hung in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. Lira studied him carefully. The rigid lines of his profile softened just enough beneath the moonlight to make him seem almost human. Almost. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked quietly. Kalen's eyes finally met hers, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something flicker beneath the surface. "Because the strongest chains aren't the ones wrapped around your wrists," Kalen said, his voice low and deliberate. "They're the ones you don't even know are there." Lyra's breath caught, her heart pounding softly beneath the weight of his words. And as the stars watched silently overhead, she realized that surviving Kalen's world wasn't just about strength. It was about understanding the chains she wore, and the ones Kalen kept hidden beneath his skin. The night air was colder than Lira expected. It slipped beneath the thin fabric of her tunic, making her shiver as she walked beside Kalen through the fortress courtyard. He moved silently, each step fluid and deliberate, like a shadow gliding over stone. Lyra's footsteps felt clumsy in comparison, the soft scuff of her worn boots a jarring contrast to his practiced grace. The courtyard stretched endlessly beneath the silver glow of the moon, its emptiness vast and unsettling. In the distance, a torch flickered near the outer walls, but no other signs of life stirred. Kalen's wolves were either patrolling the borders or sleeping, leaving the two of them alone under the star-scattered sky. Lyra's fingers brushed against the faint rope burns still lingering on her wrist, a reminder of how little time had passed since she arrived. And yet, standing here beneath the open sky, she felt further from her old life than ever before. "Do you know why your pack rebelled against me?" Kalen's voice cut through the silence, like a blade. Lira hesitated, her eyes flickering toward his face, but his expression remained unreadable. "They wanted freedom," she answered carefully. "They believed your rule would destroy us." Kalen's lips curved faintly, but there was no humor in the gesture. "Freedom," he repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "Your father thought freedom meant defying me." Lyra's chest tightened at the mention of her father. "He thought he was protecting us," she said softly. Kalen stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The moonlight cast sharp shadows along the angles of his face, making his features seem even more severe. "Your father's rebellion cost lives. More than I intended to take." Lyra's throat tightened, guilt gnawing at her ribs like teeth. "I know," she admitted, lowering her gaze. "But he wasn't cruel. He was desperate," Kalen interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "And desperate men make dangerous choices." Lira swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. "I didn't come here to remind you of what's already lost," Kalen said, his gaze softening, if only slightly. "I brought you here because the people you left behind aren't finished. There are whispers of another rebellion forming, this time without your father's hand to guide them." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. "What?" Kalen's eyes gleamed beneath the pale light, cold and sharp like the edge of a blade. "They haven't given up," he continued, watching her carefully. "And if they rise again, I'll have no choice but to crush them. Thoroughly." Lyra's heart pounded, the ground beneath her feet feeling suddenly unsteady. "My pack is broken," she whispered. "They wouldn't." "They would," Kalen interrupted, stepping closer. His presence loomed, heavy and unrelenting. "War breeds resentment, and resentment festers. You know this as well as I do." Lira clenched her fists at her sides, struggling to steady her breathing. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the wind. Kalen's gaze didn't waver. "Stay close," he said simply. "I need someone who understands them, someone they might still trust." Lyra's brows furrowed in confusion. "You think they'll listen to me?" Kalen's expression darkened faintly, as if the idea left a bitter taste in his mouth. "They may not listen, but they'll watch. And that's enough." Lyra's skin prickled under his stare, an unsettling realization settling in her chest. "You're using me," she said quietly. Kalen didn't deny it. "I'm keeping you alive," he replied without hesitation. "Consider that whatever you like." The cold truth of his words cut deeper than Lira expected. "You said survival isn't about strength," she murmured, meeting his gaze. "It's about knowing when to fight and when to run." Kalen stepped closer, his shadow stretching long beneath the moon. Then learn when to stand still, he said softly, his eyes glinting with dangerous intent. Lira swallowed hard, the intensity in his gaze pinning her in place like a blade pressed to her throat. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Kalen studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Because power isn't always taken by force," he replied. "Sometimes, it slips quietly into the hands of the one no one sees coming." Lyra's breath hitched, the implication behind his words lingering in the cold air between them. By the time they returned to the East Wing, the fortress had sunk into complete stillness. Kalen led her down the corridor in silence, but just as they reached her room, he paused, resting his hand lightly on the doorframe. "You'll join me tomorrow," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "For what?" Lira asked cautiously. Kalen's lips curved faintly, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "To learn." The door clicked softly behind her as Kalen left, his footsteps fading into the distance. Lira leaned against the wall, exhaling shakily as the weight of his words settled over her. To learn. But what exactly did Kalen intend to teach her? Sleep didn't come easily. Lira lay awake, her thoughts tangling into knots she couldn't unravel. Kalen's presence lingered in her mind, his words circling like wolves waiting for the right moment to strike. There was something dangerous in his gaze, something she couldn't quite place. But beneath that danger lay curiosity. And perhaps that was the most dangerous part of all. Lira turned toward the window, watching as the first slivers of dawn crept over the horizon. Whatever Kalen's intentions were, one thing had become clear. She was no longer just a prisoner in his stronghold. She was a piece on his board. And the game was only just beginning. Chapter 4, Lessons of the Alpha. The sun bled across the horizon, its pale light barely warming the cold stone walls of the fortress. Lira stood in the courtyard once more, her breath curling in soft plumes in the morning air. The fortress was already stirring, wolves moving like shadows through the open field, their eyes flashing in the dim glow of dawn. Lyra's gaze lingered on the group of warriors sparring near the edge of the training grounds. Their movements were swift, brutal, and efficient, every strike carrying the weight of years spent honing their skills. She could feel their disdain in the way their gazes skimmed over her, as if her mere presence was an insult to the space they occupied. It didn't matter that Kalen had brought her here. She was still an outsider. Her fingers brushed the frayed rope burn on her wrist, a reminder that she wasn't one of them, and likely never would be. "Try not to look so small," Kalen's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Lira turned to find him standing a few paces away, his sharp gaze fixed on the sparring wolves. "I wasn't aware that was something I could control," Lira replied quietly, lowering her hand to her side. Kalen's eyes flickered toward her, his lips curving faintly. "Perception can be as powerful as strength," he said. "The pack senses weakness. They'll exploit it the moment they see it." Lira shifted uncomfortably beneath his stare. "Why does it matter?" she asked softly. "I'm not a threat to them." Kalen's expression darkened, the faint amusement draining from his features. "You're standing here," he replied. "That's threat enough." Before Lira could question his meaning, Kalen motioned for her to follow him. "Come," he ordered. "You're not here to watch." Her stomach twisted, but she obeyed, trailing him as they crossed the courtyard. Wolves stepped aside as Kalen passed, their heads dipping in silent acknowledgement of his authority. Lira felt their eyes follow her like shadows. At the center of the training grounds, Kalen stopped, his gaze sweeping over the gathered warriors. "Marcus," he called out. A tall, broad-shouldered wolf stepped forward. His black hair was tied back, and a jagged scar ran down the side of his neck, a reminder of a battle long since past. "Yes, Alphas?" Marcus's voice was rough but respectful. Kalen's eyes flickered toward Lira. "Pair her with someone." Lira's heart lurched. Marcus arched a brow, but didn't question the command. "As you wish." He gestured toward a wolf lingering near the back of the group. "Joran." The wolf stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as they settled on Lira. "She's not one of us," Joran said bluntly, arms crossed over his chest. Kalen's gaze sharpened, and the tension in the courtyard thickened. "She's here," Kalen replied evenly. "That's enough." Joran's eyes darkened, but he nodded, clearly unwilling to challenge the alpha directly. Lira shifted nervously as Joran approached, his posture tense with irritation. "I don't see the point in this," Joran muttered under his breath, loud enough for Lira to hear. "Then let her prove you right," Kalen said simply, stepping back to watch. Joran's gaze met Lira's, and for a brief moment, she saw the hesitation flicker behind his eyes. He didn't want to fight her, but he would if Kalen ordered it. Lira swallowed hard, squaring her shoulders as best she could. "I don't want to hurt you," she admitted quietly. Joran smirked, the faintest glimmer of amusement dancing in his eyes. "Don't worry," he replied, raising his fists. "You won't." The match began with little ceremony. Joran struck first, his movements quick but restrained, as if he wasn't taking the fight seriously. Lira twisted out of the way, barely avoiding the blow that skimmed past her shoulder. She stumbled back, heart pounding. Kalen's voice echoed in her mind. Perception is as powerful as strength. The wolves weren't watching for her to win. They were waiting for her to break. Joran advanced again, his next strike more deliberate. Lira dodged, slipping to the side, but her footing faltered. He caught her wrist, yanking her forward with little effort. For a brief moment, she felt the warmth of his skin, the overwhelming strength behind his grip. But Lira didn't resist. Instead, she let her body go limp, using the momentum to twist around him. Joran's balance wavered just long enough for her to pull free, stumbling back as he turned to face her. His brow furrowed slightly, surprised by the subtle shift in her movements. "She's quick," someone muttered from the sidelines. Joran's smirk faded. He moved again, this time faster. Lira ducked beneath his next strike, but she wasn't fast enough. His leg swept out, catching her ankle. She hit the ground hard, the breath rushing from her lungs. Joran pinned her, his knee pressing into her back. "Yield," he ordered, his tone flat. Lira gritted her teeth, struggling beneath him, but it was useless. "Yield," he repeated. Lira's fists clenched against the dirt. The other wolves were watching. Survival isn't about strength. It's about knowing which battles to fight and when to run. "I yield," she whispered. Joran released her immediately, stepping back as Lira rose shakily to her feet. The courtyard fell into silence, save for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Kalen's gaze lingered on her, unreadable. "She learns," he said softly, though it was unclear if he was speaking to her or himself. Lira wiped the dirt from her palms, swallowing the bitter taste of defeat. But she hadn't broken, and perhaps that was enough. As the training session ended, Lira lingered near the edge of the courtyard, watching as the wolves dispersed. Joran approached her, his expression softer than before. "You did better than I expected," he admitted. Lira offered a faint smile. "That makes one of us." Joran chuckled. "You'll survive." As he walked away, Lira felt Kalen's presence beside her once more. "You yielded," he observed. Lira glanced at him, unsure if the remark carried judgment or approval. "You said survival wasn't about strength," she replied carefully. Kalen's eyes narrowed faintly, but the corner of his mouth twitched in the smallest of smiles. "Good," he murmured, "because you'll need more than strength to survive what's coming." The courtyard emptied slowly, the pack dissolving into the fortress, like shadows retreating with a fading light. Lira remained where she stood, her gaze following Joran as he disappeared through the arched doorway leading to the main hall. The ache in her ribs throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a reminder of how easily Joran had bested her. She had yielded, but it felt less like a victory of survival and more like the sting of defeat. Kalen hadn't moved from his spot. He watched her quietly, his gaze as sharp and unforgiving as the blade strapped to his hip. Lira met his eyes, forcing herself not to look away. "You're disappointed," he said, reading the tension in her stance. Lira exhaled slowly. "I thought I could do better." Kalen's lips curled slightly at the corners, more smirk than smile. "You expected to win?" "No," she admitted. But I thought I'd last longer. Kalen crossed his arms, studying her with a mix of curiosity and calculation. Endurance is important, but knowing when to fall is just as valuable. Lyra's brow furrowed. That feels like a convenient way to explain losing. A low chuckle rumbled from Kalen's throat. You weren't meant to win, Lira. This wasn't about victory. Then what was it about? She asked, frustration curling at the edges of her voice. Kalen stepped closer, the weight of his presence more suffocating up close. It was about understanding your place here, and theirs. Wolves respond to strength, but they respect restraint. Lyra's pulse quickened under his gaze. She wanted to deny the truth behind his words, but she'd seen the shift in the wolves' expressions after the match. Joran had dismissed her before the fight began, but by the end, there had been something different in his eyes. Not respect. Not yet. But something close enough to build upon. Strength without control leads to rebellion, Kalen continued, voice low. And submission without purpose leads to slaughter. You need to know the balance between them. Lira swallowed the knot forming in her throat. You've spent your life avoiding conflict, Kalen added, his eyes narrowing slightly. I need to know if you're capable of standing in the fire, not running from it. The weight of his words pressed against her chest like a stone. I'm not a warrior, Lira said softly, lowering her gaze. I never wanted to be one. Kalen's expression didn't shift. Neither did I. Lyra's eyes snapped to his, searching for the truth behind his calm demeanor. You expect me to believe that? She asked, disbelief threading through her voice. Kalen's gaze darkened, and for the first time, she noticed the faint lines etched around his eyes, the subtle signs of a man who had carried more weight than his years should allow. Wanting something doesn't change what you are, he replied. The world doesn't give us the luxury of choosing peace, Lira. It offers survival to those willing to take it by whatever means necessary. Lira felt the sharp edge behind his words, the unspoken history lurking beneath his carefully controlled exterior. Before she could respond, the heavy oak doors leading to the fortress creaked open. Darian stepped into the courtyard, his gaze flickering between them before settling on Kalen. Border patrols returned, Darian announced, his tone clipped. There was trouble near the northern ridge. Kalen's eyes sharpened. Rival pack. Darian nodded. Scouts from the Ironfangs. They didn't cross, but they were too close for comfort. Lira caught the subtle shift in Kalen's stance, the faint tightening of his jaw, and the cold calculation in his eyes. Double the patrols, Kalen ordered. I want eyes on every corner of our borders until further notice. Darian hesitated. And if they return? Kalen's expression hardened. If they return, we remind them whose land this is. Darian inclined his head in understanding but paused before turning to leave. His gaze drifted to Lira briefly, his eyes unreadable. Should I escort her back to the East Wing? Darian asked carefully. Kalen's gaze flickered toward Lira, but instead of answering immediately, he studied her for a long moment. No, Kalen said at last. She stays with me? Lyra's stomach twisted at the declaration, though she wasn't sure if it was relief or dread curling through her veins. Darian's brows lifted faintly, but he didn't question the decision. As you wish, he replied, disappearing into the fortress once more. Lira turned toward Kalen, uncertainty etched across her face. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kalen's gaze lingered on the distant treetops bordering the fortress. Because if the Ironfangs are moving, he said quietly, then you're safer in the wolf's shadow than alone in the dark. Kalen's quarters were nothing like Lira expected. The room was spacious but sparse, its stone walls bare except for a few weapons mounted near the hearth. A large wooden table occupied the far side of the room, strewn with maps and faded parchments. A single lantern flickered in the corner, casting long shadows across the floor. Lira hovered near the doorway, unsure of where she fit within this space. Kalen strode to the table, rolling up one of the maps with practiced efficiency. You can sit, he said without glancing at her. Lira hesitated but eventually lowered herself onto the edge of a nearby chair, folding her hands in her lap to steady the nervous energy thrumming beneath her skin. Is this about the Ironfangs? She asked after a long silence. Kalen's eyes flicked to her, though his expression remained unreadable. In part, he admitted. But it's more than that. Lira frowned. You think they'll come for the fortress? Kalen's lips pressed into a thin line. They'll test our defenses, he replied. That's what wolves do when they sense weakness. Lyra's gaze drifted toward the map, the faint outlines of the borderlands marked in black ink. And you think I'm part of that weakness, she guessed. Kalen's eyes met hers, something unreadable flickering behind his gaze. I think you're part of the answer, he said quietly. Lyra's heart skipped a beat, confusion curling in her chest. I don't understand. Kalen's gaze softened, though only slightly. You will, he replied. But not yet. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, filling the silence between them with its quiet hum. Lira leaned back in her chair, the weight of Kalen's words settling over her like a heavy cloak. She wasn't sure if she was ready to learn what he saw in her, but something told her that in Kalen's world, readiness didn't matter. It was only a question of survival. Chapter 5: The Gathering Storm. The fortress felt different at night. Lira had learned to recognize the subtle shifts, the change in the air when patrols returned, the way the torches flickered uneasily when the wind carried distant howls. But tonight, the silence felt heavier, as if the walls were holding their breath. Kalen hadn't spoken much after Darian left. He kept to the far end of the room, poring over the maps stretched across his table. The flickering lantern illuminated the hard lines of his face, casting shadows beneath his eyes that made him look even more dangerous than usual. Lira sat by the fire, drawing her knees to her chest as she watched him. The crackling flames were the only thing breaking the silence between them, but Lira didn't mind. She found a strange sort of comfort in the quiet. For all his ruthlessness, Kalen wasn't the constant storm she had expected. He wasn't cruel without reason. If anything, his restraint unsettled her more than his threats. You're staring, Kalen said without looking up. Lira blinked, startled out of her thoughts. I wasn't. You were, he interrupted smoothly, rolling up another map with careful precision. If you have something to ask, do it. I don't like wasting time. Lira hesitated, shifting in her chair. You said I'm part of the answer, she began softly.
What did you mean by that?
Kalen glanced at her, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't place. You're a reminder, he replied, leaning against the table with his arms crossed. Your presence makes them uneasy. They see you and remember the rebellion. That fear keeps them in line. Lyra's stomach twisted. I don't want to be a reminder, she whispered. Kalen's gaze darkened. It doesn't matter what you want, he said, voice low but firm. You don't get to choose how others see you. You either use it or it uses you. Lira looked away, her fingers tightening around the edges of her sleeves. I'm not like you, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Kalen's sharp gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he spoke.
Not yet.
The weight of his words settled heavily between them, but before Lira could respond, a knock echoed at the door. Darian entered without waiting for permission. There's news, Darian said, his eyes flicking briefly to Lira before focusing on Kalen. Kalen straightened, his demeanor shifting instantly. From the northern border? Darian nodded. The scouts found tracks leading toward the ridge, Ironfangs for sure. They're watching us. Lyra's heart tightened. They haven't crossed? Kalen asked, his voice calm but colder now. Not yet, Darian replied. But they will. Sooner rather than later. Kalen's jaw tightened as he pushed away from the table, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for battle. Double the night patrols, Kalen ordered. I want every possible entrance covered. If they set 1 foot on our land, I want to know about it. Darian inclined his head. And if they do cross? Kalen's eyes darkened. We'll deal with them the same way we dealt with the last pack that tried. Darian didn't press further. As he turned to leave, his gaze lingered on Lira once more, as if measuring her. Lira forced herself to meet his stare, unwilling to shrink beneath it. When Darian finally left, Kalen crossed the room, retrieving the long dagger strapped to the wall near the hearth. You should get some rest, he said, his tone less harsh but still distant. Lira watched him carefully. You don't trust them, she said quietly. Kalen's hand stilled on the hilt of his weapon. No, he admitted. I don't. The fire crackled softly between them, filling the space left by his words. Lyra's fingers brushed the edge of her chair, the weight of the unknown pressing heavily against her chest. They're going to come for this place, she murmured. Kalen met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something beneath the cold exterior. They've been coming for a long time, he said. I'm just the last one left standing. Lira lowered her head, uncertain what to say. In the quiet, she realized that Kalen wasn't just guarding the fortress. He was guarding himself. And for reasons she didn't yet understand, he had decided to let her stay inside those walls. Lira didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay awake in the small chamber Kalen had offered her, listening to the distant footsteps of wolves patrolling outside. The fortress never truly rested, not with the Ironfangs lurking beyond the borders. The heavy wooden door remained unlocked, but even if she wanted to leave, she wouldn't dare. Kalen's words echoed in her mind. You either use it or it uses you. Lira wasn't sure which option terrified her more. She drifted into a restless half-sleep as the stars faded beyond the distant mountains. The morning came abruptly, sunlight streaming through the narrow window above her bed. Lira dressed quickly, braiding her hair out of her face before stepping into the corridor. The fortress buzzed with energy, wolves sharpening weapons, hauling supplies, and reinforcing the perimeter. She found Kalen near the outer walls, speaking quietly with Darien as they surveyed the distant ridgeline. Lira approached cautiously, her steps light against the stone. They're still out there, she asked softly. Kalen glanced at her. Yes, he replied. Why haven't they attacked yet? Darien smirked faintly, though his eyes remained serious. They're waiting for the right moment, he said. Testing our defenses. If they find a weakness, they'll exploit it. Lira shivered at the thought. And if they don't find one, she asked. Kalen's gaze sharpened, the faintest edge of a smirk tugging at his lips. Then they'll make one. Lyra's heart pounded harder in her chest. The Ironfangs weren't just wolves looking for land. They were predators circling prey. And Kalen's fortress was the prize. By midday, the patrols returned, reporting no further movement along the borders. But the tension in the fortress didn't ease. Lira could feel it in the air, heavy and suffocating. Kalen stood near the watchtower as the sun dipped below the horizon once more. Lira approached him carefully, unsure if her presence would be welcome. You think they'll attack tonight, she said, more of a statement than a question. Kalen didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she expected. I think they're waiting for someone to make a mistake. Lyra's gaze lingered on him, and for the first time, she realized the weight he carried wasn't just for himself. It was for the entire pack. And for reasons she didn't yet understand, that weight now included her. The moon rose slowly, casting silver light over the fortress walls. The courtyard below was empty, save for the guards pacing along the perimeter. Lira watched from the second-floor balcony, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the cold wind tugged at her hair. Kalen stood farther down the walkway, his silhouette carved against the pale glow of the moon. He leaned against the stone railing, eyes fixed on the dark expanse of the forest stretching beyond the outer gates. His posture was relaxed, but Lira wasn't fooled. Every muscle in his body seemed coiled, ready to strike at the first sign of movement. For the past hour, neither of them had spoken. The weight of the Ironfangs' presence lingered, thick as smoke in the air between them. Lira finally broke the silence. Have you fought them before? She asked softly, her voice carrying over the wind. Kalen's gaze didn't waver from the treetops. More than once. She hesitated. And you survived every time? A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, though it didn't reach his eyes. I'm still standing, aren't I? Lira didn't laugh. There was something unsettling in his tone, an undercurrent of bitterness that made her stomach twist. Why do they want this place so badly? She pressed. There are other lands, other territories. Kalen's expression darkened. Wolves like them don't care about land. They care about power. And taking what isn't theirs. His gaze finally flickered toward her, sharp as a blade beneath the moonlight. They see weakness here. Lyra's heart pounded softly in her chest. Is theirs? Kalen didn't answer right away. He studied her carefully, as if weighing how much to reveal.
Not yet, he said at last.
But they think there is. Lira shifted uncomfortably beneath his stare. She wasn't naive. She knew she was part of the reason the Ironfangs believed Kalen's pack vulnerable. A fragment of the broken rebellion, delivered to their alpha like a prize. They see me as a weakness, she murmured, lowering her gaze. Kalen stepped closer, his boots echoing softly against the stone. You are the daughter of their enemy. That makes you more than a weakness. Lira frowned, glancing up at him. Then what am I? Kalen's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. A target, he replied coldly. One they won't hesitate to use. Lyra's breath hitched, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if the cold creeping down her spine was from the wind or his words. But I'm not part of this fight, she whispered. Kalen's gaze hardened. You are now. Before Lira could respond, a distant howl echoed through the trees. It was faint but unmistakable, a long, haunting call that carried across the border like a threat woven into the wind. Lira stiffened, gripping the stone railing tightly as the sound faded. Kalen's eyes glinted beneath the pale light, but he showed no fear. They're testing us, he said quietly, measuring how long it will take for us to react. Lira swallowed hard. Shouldn't we do something? Kalen exhaled slowly, his fingers brushing the dagger strapped to his waist.
Not yet.
Lira blinked, startled by his calm. But if they attack? They won't. Kalen's gaze never left the treeline. Not tonight. His certainty unnerved her. How can you be so sure? Kalen's eyes flicked to hers, and for a brief moment, she saw the raw edge of something dangerous flicker beneath his mask of control. Because they're not the only ones watching, he said. Lira followed his gaze, searching the darkness for shapes she couldn't see. The hair along her neck prickled. They weren't alone. Hours passed before Lira finally retreated to her room. The fortress remained quiet, but the howls had lingered long after she left the balcony. She sat by the small window, knees tucked to her chest as she stared at the moon hanging low in the sky. Its light stretched thin across the forest, bathing the distant treetops in silver. Her thoughts churned relentlessly, circling back to Kalen's words. A target. Lira hated the weight those words carried. She had spent most of her life avoiding the power struggles that define the wolves around her. Her father's rebellion had been the closest she'd ever come to war, and even then, she had stayed on the edges, tending to the wounded and mending broken bones. She wasn't meant to be part of this. But now, the Ironfangs hunted her just as much as they hunted Kalen's pack. A soft knock at the door startled her. Lira rose cautiously, opening it just enough to find Darian standing in the hallway. You should sleep, Darian said, his tone softer than usual. I'm not tired, Lira replied, though the exhaustion tugging at her limbs betrayed her. Darian studied her for a moment, his gaze lingering on the faint bruise along her jaw, a reminder of her sparring match with Joran earlier that day. Kalen sent me to check on you, he admitted. But I think you already knew that. Lira smiled faintly. I figured. Darian leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. You made an impression today. I lost, Lira pointed out. Doesn't matter. You didn't run. Lira met his gaze, unsure how to respond. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Darian straightened. Get some rest, Lira, he said, turning to leave. Tomorrow's coming whether you're ready or not. The door clicked softly behind him, but his words lingered long after he left. Lira sat by the window until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. She found Kalen in the training grounds the next morning, sparring alone with a wooden staff. He moved with lethal precision, each strike fluid and controlled. His shirt clung to his skin, damp with sweat, but his breath remained even, like this was nothing more than routine. Lira waited until he finished before approaching. Kalen lowered the staff, wiping his hands on a cloth draped over the nearby bench. You're up early, he noted without turning around. Lira stepped carefully into the ring. I want to train, she said firmly. Kalen arched a brow. You already did. I want to do more, Lira pressed, standing her ground. I won't be a weakness for your pack to exploit. Kalen's gaze flicked to hers, something unreadable passing through his eyes. After a moment, he tossed her one of the spare staffs. Then let's begin. Chapter 6. Beneath the Skin of a Wolf. Lyra's palms ached from gripping the staff too tightly. The wooden weapon felt heavier with each passing minute, sweat dampening her grip as she faced Kalen in the training ring. The sun hovered low in the sky, casting long shadows over the fortress courtyard as dawn bled into morning. Kalen moved without effort, each strike swift, each parry perfectly timed. He circled her like a predator playing with its prey, watching for weakness. And Lira knew she was full of them. She lunged, but Kalen sidestepped easily, knocking the staff from her hands with one fluid motion. The wooden weapon clattered to the stone floor. Too slow, Kalen said, his gaze sharp as he lowered his own staff. Lira bent down, chest heaving as she retrieved the weapon. Her fingers trembled, but she tightened them around the wood, refusing to let him see her falter. I'm trying, she said through gritted teeth. You're thinking, Kalen replied, twirling the staff lazily between his fingers. That's the problem. A wolf doesn't stop to think mid-hunt. It moves. Instinct. Reflex. Lira straightened, leveling her gaze at him. I'm not a wolf, she said quietly. Kalen's eyes narrowed, his lips curving faintly. You will be by the time I'm finished with you. Before Lira could respond, Kalen surged forward, his staff sweeping toward her ribs. She twisted at the last second, barely dodging the strike. Her heart hammered wildly in her chest as she stumbled backward, raising her weapon in defense. Kalen didn't relent. His movements were relentless but measured, each blow designed to push her to the edge, without tipping her over it. He was testing her, watching for cracks in her resolve. Lira parried his next strike, but the force behind it rattled her bones. She dug her heels into the stone, gritting her teeth as Kalen bore down on her. You hesitate, Kalen growled, driving her further toward the edge of the ring. That's what will kill you. Lyra's breath hitched as her back brushed against the cold stone wall of the courtyard. Kalen pressed the staff against her collarbone, pinning her in place. Her eyes met his, fire flickering beneath her gaze. I'm not hesitating, she whispered. Lira dropped low, sweeping her leg out beneath him. Kalen shifted at the last second, narrowly avoiding the sweep, but the sudden movement forced him off balance. She pressed forward, slamming her staff against his. Wood cracked against wood, the impact vibrating through her arms. Kalen's eyes glinted with something dangerous, something almost like approval. Better, he admitted, stepping back. Lyra's chest rose and fell, her muscles trembling from exertion. You pushed too hard, she said, lowering the staff. Kalen tilted his head, his gaze lingering on her. Because the ones coming for you won't hold back. Lira swallowed hard, brushing sweat from her brow. Is that what this is about? She asked. The Ironfangs? Kalen's expression shifted, the flicker of amusement fading into something darker. They're not the only ones watching, he said quietly. Lyra's stomach twisted. I'm not part of this fight, Kalen. His gaze snapped to hers, sharp and unyielding.
You are now, he replied.
Whether you want to be or not. The courtyard emptied slowly after training ended. Wolves dispersed to their tasks, leaving Lira alone beneath the watchful gaze of the fortress walls. Her body ached, but she forced herself to remain upright, unwilling to show weakness. She turned toward the stone archway leading to the fortress interior when a voice cut through the air. You're improving? Lira glanced over her shoulder to find Darian leaning against the wall, arms crossed casually over his chest. Barely, she replied, exhaling softly. Darian smirked. You lasted longer than Joran expected. Lira arched a brow. Is that supposed to be comforting? Darian pushed off the wall, falling into step beside her as she made her way toward the east wing. It means they're watching, he said. And that's not a bad thing. Lira frowned. Feels like it is. They don't trust you, Darian admitted. But they're starting to wonder if they should. Lira glanced at him, sensing the weight behind his words. "And what about you?" she asked. "Do you trust me?" Darian met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I think you're still figuring out who you are," he replied. "And that's more dangerous than anything else." Lyra's steps slowed as they reached her chamber door.
"Why?"
Darian hesitated. "Because people who don't know their place are the hardest to control." Lyra's pulse quickened at the implication, but before she could respond, Darian stepped back, nodding toward the door. "Rest," he said. "You'll need it." Lira lingered in the hallway for a long moment before finally stepping into the safety of her room. Nightfall brought with it an unsettling quiet. Lira lay awake beneath the thin blankets, staring at the ceiling as the faint glow of the moon filtered through the small window. Her body ached, but her mind wouldn't still. She thought of Kalen's words, of the way he watched her like she was something fragile and dangerous all at once. A target. The thought lingered, curling around her like smoke. Before sleep could take her, another sound pierced the silence, soft footsteps just beyond her door. Lira tensed, her hand slipping beneath the pillow to grip the dagger she kept hidden there. A shadow passed by the small gap beneath the door, pausing just long enough to make her breath catch in her throat. Seconds passed like hours. Then the footsteps retreated, fading down the corridor. Lira remained still, listening until the fortress fell silent once more. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't open the door. Instead, she tightened her grip on the dagger and waited, eyes fixed on the doorway until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Lira didn't sleep. The footsteps had long faded, but the weight of them lingered like a blade hovering over her throat. She stayed motionless in bed, the dagger cold in her palm as she listened for any sound beyond the door. None came. Still, the sensation of being watched refused to dissipate. The thin veil of safety she had managed to weave around herself in Kalen's fortress had been torn open. Whoever had stood outside her door wasn't there by accident. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the narrow window, Lyra's muscles ached from staying tense for so long. She sat up slowly, pushing the dagger beneath the pillow once more. A foolish act, perhaps, but part of her refused to walk the fortress halls visibly armed. A knock at the door startled her, even though it was soft. She hesitated, gripping the edge of the bed, before forcing herself to rise. "Lira." Darian's voice carried through the wood. "You awake?" She opened the door, stepping aside to let him in. Darian's sharp gaze swept the room instantly, his posture relaxed but alert. "You didn't sleep," he noted, crossing his arms. Lira sat back on the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. "There was someone outside my door last night," she admitted quietly. Darian's eyes narrowed. "Did you see who it was?" She shook her head.
"No."
"They didn't try to come in, but they waited. Just long enough for me to know they were there." Darian's expression darkened, though he remained silent for a long moment. "I'll find out who it was," he said finally. Lira exhaled, her hands tightening in her lap. "Do you think they'll try again?" Darian studied her, his gaze unreadable. "Maybe," he replied. "But not while Kalen is here." His words should have been reassuring, but they weren't. Lira lowered her head. "That's the problem, isn't it? Kalen won't always be here to guard me." Darian hesitated. "No," he admitted, voice low. "He won't." Silence stretched between them until Lira finally rose from the bed. "I need to keep training," she said, steeling herself. "If someone's going to stand outside my door, I won't be caught unprepared next time." Darian's lips curved faintly, though the expression was tinged with something else, something closer to caution. "You're learning faster than I expected," he said. "But you're still not a wolf, Lira." Lira met his gaze, unwavering. "Not yet." The training yard was colder than it had been the day before, the air biting through the thin fabric of Lira's tunic. She tightened the wraps around her wrists as she stepped into the courtyard, where several wolves had already gathered to spar. The whispers started almost immediately. Lira felt their eyes settle on her like knives, but she forced herself to keep walking. She wasn't blind to the way they watched her, half curiosity, half contempt. She didn't belong among them, not yet.
But that would change.
Joran was already at the far end of the training circle, twirling a wooden staff lazily between his hands. His eyes narrowed when he saw her approach. Here to try again? Joran smirked, cracking his knuckles. Didn't have enough yesterday? Lira rolled her shoulders. Maybe you'll break a sweat this time. His grin widened, but she caught the flicker of something else. Approval, perhaps, or amusement at her boldness. Kalen stood on the upper balcony overlooking the yard, arms crossed as he observed the matches below. His gaze drifted to her, though he didn't intervene. Darian leaned against the stone railing beside him, watching as Joran stepped into the ring. Careful, Joran, Darian called down. She's got more fight in her than you think. Joran snorted, but said nothing. Lira met him in the center of the ring, gripping the wooden staff tightly. The match began, without ceremony. Joran moved faster this time, his strikes sharp and precise. Lira barely had time to block the first blow before he pivoted, sweeping his staff toward her legs. She jumped back, but not fast enough. The staff struck her shin, sending a dull ache rippling up her leg. Lira gritted her teeth and pressed forward, swinging her staff in a quick, defensive arc. Joran parried easily, but this time she caught the faint shift in his balance, the subtle dip of his left shoulder. He overextended. Lira twisted, ducking beneath his guard and slamming the end of her staff into his ribs. Joran stumbled, his eyes flashing with surprise. A few of the wolves watching muttered quietly, but no one interrupted. Joran straightened, rolling his shoulder. Lucky hit, he muttered. Lira didn't respond. She lunged again. Their staffs clashed, wood biting into wood, but Lira refused to back down. The fight stretched on longer than before, each exchange fiercer than the last. Joran was stronger, but Lira was faster. She learned with every misstep. Each bruise a lesson in movement, each strike an answer to his strength. By the time Kalen raised his hand, signaling the end of the match, Lira stood panting but unbroken. Joran exhaled sharply, wiping sweat from his brow. You're stubborn, he admitted, grinning despite himself. I'll give you that. Lira offered a faint smile, leaning on the staff for support.
I have to be, she replied.
Kalen's voice carried from the balcony.
She's learning, he said.
The other wolves turned toward him, their murmurs fading beneath his cold stare. And she's not finished yet. Lira felt the weight of those words settle over her. As the other wolves dispersed, Kalen descended the stairs, crossing the courtyard with slow, deliberate steps. You lasted longer, he observed. Lira wiped her hands against her tunic, trying to steady her breathing. Because I stopped hesitating, she replied. Kalen's gaze lingered on her for a long moment. Good, he said quietly. He turned, motioning for her to follow. Lira fell into step beside him, her heart still pounding in her chest. As they walked, Kalen's voice softened just enough for her to catch the faint edge beneath it. Next time, he said, don't yield. Lira's fingers tightened around the staff. She didn't plan to. Chapter 7: The Alpha's Shadow. The fortress remained restless long after the sparring ended. Lira could feel the tension pulsing beneath the surface, weaving itself through the walls like an unseen force. The Ironfangs had not crossed the border, but their presence loomed over the pack like a storm cloud waiting to break. Kalen had dismissed the wolves from training, but Lira lingered in the courtyard, tracing the edge of her staff with her fingers. Joran had retreated without much ceremony, though not before muttering something about sharpening his skills for the next match. She wasn't sure if he was mocking her or genuinely impressed. Either way, Lira counted the encounter as progress. A few bruises were a small price to pay for earning slivers of respect. Darian approached from the far end of the courtyard, his pace unhurried. Lira glanced up as he neared, catching the faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. You're getting under their skin, he remarked, nodding toward the retreating wolves. Lira exhaled softly, lowering the staff. I wasn't trying to. Doesn't matter. Darian leaned against the stone railing, watching the last of the wolves disappear into the fortress. The fact that you're still standing is enough. Lira wiped her palms against her tunic, wincing as she stretched her bruised shoulder. How long before they stop seeing me as an outsider? Darian arched a brow. That depends. On what? He pushed off the railing, his gaze locking onto hers. On whether you survive what's coming. Lyra's chest tightened at the weight behind his words. I thought Kalen had everything under control. Darian's eyes darkened slightly. Kalen controls his pack, but the Ironfangs are a different matter. If they're circling, it's only a matter of time before they strike. Lyra's fingers instinctively brushed over the faint scar on her wrist, a reminder of the ropes that once bound her. And when they do, she asked softly. Darian's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he glanced toward the upper balcony. Kalen stood there, his silhouette stark against the light of the rising sun. He'll handle it, Darian said quietly. He always does. Lira found herself drawn to the fortress walls later that evening, pacing along the perimeter beneath the fading light. The northern ridge stretched in the distance, its shadowed treetops shrouded in mist. Despite Darian's reassurances, the sense of unease continued to gnaw at her. She stopped near one of the watchtowers, gazing out beyond the borders where the forest met the horizon. The Ironfangs were out there. Somewhere. Lira didn't hear Kalen's footsteps until he was beside her. You're restless, he said without preamble. Lira didn't flinch, but her grip on the railing tightened.
Shouldn't I be? She replied.
The Ironfangs could attack at any moment. Kalen's gaze flickered toward the distant treeline, his expression unreadable. They will, he said simply. Lira turned to face him fully, searching his face for any trace of doubt. You say that like it doesn't bother you. Kalen's lips twitched faintly. It doesn't. Lira frowned. Why not? Kalen stepped closer to the edge of the wall, resting his hands on the stone as he peered out over the forest. Because fear makes men reckless, he replied. And recklessness is easier to kill than caution. Lira studied him carefully, the calm confidence woven into his voice both unsettling and reassuring. You're not afraid of them, she murmured. Kalen's gaze shifted, pinning her with that sharp, wolfish intensity.
I've fought worse, he said.
Lira believed him. The air between them grew heavy, the weight of unspoken words pressing down like a second skin. Finally, Lira broke the silence. Why didn't you kill me when the rebellion failed? She asked quietly. Kalen's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly, as if the question had lingered at the back of his mind for some time. I could have, he admitted. Then why didn't you? Kalen's gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he finally spoke. Because I wanted to see what you'd become. Lyra's breath caught faintly, though she wasn't sure if it was from fear or something else entirely. You think I'll change? She asked. Kalen's eyes gleamed beneath the fading light. I know you will. The fortress felt quieter as night fell. The usual hum of conversation and movement dwindled, leaving only the distant sound of wolves patrolling the outer walls. Lira sat by the hearth in the main hall, staring into the flames as they flickered and danced across the stone. Her body ached from training, but her mind refused to rest. Kalen's words echoed in her ears, circling endlessly like a whisper she couldn't shake. Because I wanted to see what you'd become. She didn't know if that should terrify her or drive her forward. A soft rustle drew her attention, and she glanced up as Darian entered the hall, carrying a flask of water. You're still awake, he observed, settling into the chair across from her. So are you, Lira pointed out. Darian chuckled, taking a sip from the flask. Kalen's right, he said after a pause. You'll change. Lira frowned, leaning back against the stone wall. Everyone keeps saying that, she muttered. But no one tells me what it means. Darian's eyes darkened faintly, though his smile didn't waver. It means that by the time this is over, you won't recognize the girl who walked through these gates, he replied. Lyra's chest tightened. I'm not sure if that's a good thing, she admitted. Darian shrugged. Depends on whether you survive. Lira lowered her gaze to the fire, watching as the flames crackled and sparked. You sound like Kalen, she said softly. Darian smirked. Maybe I've been around him too long. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with its warmth. Lira closed her eyes, exhaustion tugging at the edges of her mind. But even as she drifted toward sleep, the lingering weight of Kalen's gaze haunted her dreams. She woke to the distant sound of howls piercing the cold night air. Lira sat up abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest as the fortress stirred to life. Darian was already gone. She pushed her feet, pulling on her cloak as she stepped into the hallway. The torches flickered along the walls, casting jagged shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the stone. Lira followed the sound, her footsteps quick and silent as she made her way toward the courtyard. When she emerged, she found Kalen standing at the gates, his eyes fixed on the treeline. The Ironfangs had come. The courtyard was still, but the tension hung thick as smoke. Wolves lined the perimeter, weapons at the ready, eyes locked on the treeline beyond the outer walls. The moon hung heavy and full overhead, casting long silver shadows across the fortress grounds. Lira approached slowly, her cloak pulled tightly around her. The cold night air bit at her skin, but the chill running down her spine had little to do with the weather. Kalen stood at the center of it all, his figure outlined against the pale glow of torches burning along the gate. His posture was rigid, gaze fixed on the dark expanse of forest beyond. Even from a distance, Lira could feel the weight of his focus, the dangerous calm of a predator ready to strike. She hesitated near the edge of the courtyard, unsure if she should approach. But Kalen's voice cut through the silence without him needing to turn around. "You might as well come closer," he said quietly. "You'll see them soon enough." Lira stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she moved to stand beside him. The treeline was still, but she knew better than to trust the silence. "They've been there for an hour," Kalen continued, voice low. "Watching. Waiting." Lira narrowed her eyes, searching the shadows between the trees. "I don't see anything," she admitted, gripping the edge of her cloak to keep her hands from trembling. Kalen's gaze didn't waver. "That's because they don't want to be seen."
"Not yet."
A ripple of unease prickled along the back of Lira's neck. "Why wait?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kalen's lips twitched faintly, though there was no humor in his expression. "Because they're testing us," he replied. "They want to know if we'll break before they make their move." Lira swallowed hard. "Will we?" Kalen finally turned toward her, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. "No," he said simply. The certainty in his voice steadied something inside her, but it also left a lingering question. How could he be so sure? Before she could ask, a low growl rumbled from the top of the watchtower. One of Kalen's sentries crouched near the edge, eyes gleaming in the darkness. "There," the sentry said, pointing toward the forest. Lira squinted, following the direction of his hand. At first, she saw nothing but shadows. But as her eyes adjusted, she caught the faintest glint of silver between the trees, like moonlight catching on the edge of a blade. A figure stepped forward, half hidden by the foliage.
Tall, broad-shouldered.
His dark cloak rippled like liquid shadow as he emerged, his face obscured beneath the hood. But it wasn't the figure itself that sent a chill down Lyra's spine. It was the wolves flanking him, 3 on each side, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Who is he?" Lira whispered. Kalen's eyes narrowed.
"Vaughn," he said grimly.
"Alpha of the Ironfangs." Lyra's pulse quickened. She had heard of Vaughn before, the stories whispered like ghost tales around campfires. His pack was ruthless, known for tearing through weaker clans without hesitation. Where Kalen ruled with brutal control, Vaughn led by unleashing chaos. The Ironfang Alpha stopped just short of the gate, raising his head to look directly at Kalen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Vaughn smiled. "Your territory's looking quiet tonight, Kalen," Vaughn said, his voice smooth but edged with mockery. "I half expected to find it burning by now." Kalen stepped forward, the torchlight casting sharp shadows across his face. "It'll take more than your dogs to burn down these walls," Kalen replied coldly. Vaughn's smile widened.
"Dogs."
Vaughn mused, glancing toward his wolves. "I prefer to think of them as opportunists. And right now, they're wondering how long it'll take before you slip." Lira felt the tension ripple through the pack standing behind Kalen, but none of them moved. Kalen didn't flinch. Is that why you're here? Kalen asked, voice calm but laced with steel. To watch me slip? Vaughn chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. Not tonight, Vaughn admitted, taking a slow step back. But soon, Lyra's nails dug into her palms as Vaughn's gaze shifted, landing directly on her. And when it happens, Vaughn said, his eyes gleaming, I'll make sure to take what's left. Starting with her. Lira stiffened, the air in her lungs freezing as Vaughn's words settled over the courtyard. Kalen's expression didn't change. But the torch nearest him snapped and hissed, as if responding to the silent fury rippling beneath his skin. You won't touch her, Kalen said softly, but there was nothing gentle about the threat laced in his voice. Vaughn held Kalen's gaze for a long, dangerous moment. Then, with a faint smirk, he raised his hand. The Ironfang wolves melted back into the forest, their footsteps vanishing into the shadows as silently as they had come. Lyra's breath escaped in a shuddering exhale, but Kalen's eyes remained fixed on the trees long after Vaughn disappeared. They'll be back, Lira murmured. Kalen nodded. I know. Lira hesitated, glancing toward him. And what happens when they do? She asked softly. Kalen turned to her, his gaze steady and unyielding.
We end it, he said.
Lira didn't doubt him. But as she followed Kalen back toward the fortress, Vaughn's lingering threat echoed in her mind. She wasn't sure who she feared more, Vaughn and his wolves, or the dangerous fire that flickered beneath Kalen's calm exterior. Because fire didn't just burn enemies. It consumed everything in its path. Chapter 8. The Hunt Beneath the Moon. The moon hung heavy over the fortress, casting silver across the stone walls. Lira stood by the outer gate, her hands resting on the cold iron as the distant howl of a lone wolf echoed through the forest. It wasn't one of Kalen's wolves. She could feel it, sense it in the way the sound crawled beneath her skin like a whispered warning. The Ironfangs were still out there, watching. A full day had passed since Vaughn's appearance at the gates, but his presence lingered like smoke after a fire. Every time Lira glanced toward the trees, she expected to see him standing there, waiting just beyond the border. You're lingering too close to the edge. Lira turned sharply, finding Darian leaning against the stone archway. His arms were crossed, but his eyes held the same wariness that had settled over the fortress since Vaughn's visit. I needed air, Lira replied softly, brushing her hair behind her ear. Darian arched a brow. You think you'll find it near the gate? Lira sighed, stepping away from the iron bars. I thought I might hear something. Darian's gaze flicked toward the forest, his features hardening. They won't strike from the front, he said. Vaughn's smarter than that. Lira frowned, gripping the edges of her cloak as the wind whispered against her skin. Then how do we stop them? She asked. Darian pushed off the wall, his boots scuffing softly against the stone. We don't. Lira blinked. What do you mean? He met her gaze, the weight in his eyes making her stomach tighten. We let them come. Before Lira could press for more, Kalen's voice rang out from the far end of the courtyard. Darian. Darian straightened, offering Lira a brief glance before turning to answer his alpha's call. Lira hesitated, but something in the way Kalen's gaze lingered on her told her she wasn't meant to retreat just yet. She followed Darian toward the center of the courtyard, where Kalen stood near a ring of wolves, their forms barely visible beneath the dim torchlight. Another patrol found tracks near the eastern ridge, Kalen said, without preamble. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. They crossed the river last night. Darian stiffened. They're inside the border? Kalen's eyes narrowed. Barely. Lira felt the tension ripple through the gathered wolves. What are we going to do? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. Kalen's gaze flicked to her, his expression unreadable. We hunt them, he said simply. Lyra's heart skipped, and for a brief moment, she thought she had misheard him. Hunt them, she repeated. Isn't that dangerous? Kalen stepped closer, his gaze sharp and unwavering. It's necessary, he replied. If we wait for them to attack, they'll choose the ground. The timing, the advantage. Lira swallowed hard, glancing toward the line of trees that stretched endlessly beyond the fortress. And if we find them first, Kalen's lips curved faintly, though it wasn't a smile. Then we remind them why they fear crossing into our lands. The fortress stirred with quiet preparation. Wolves armed themselves beneath the cover of night, their movements swift and silent. Kalen's orders had spread like wildfire, igniting a sense of urgency that Lira could feel in her bones. She watched from the shadows near the armory as weapons were distributed. Daggers, spears, and bows carefully passed from one hand to another. Lyra's fingers brushed over the thin blades strapped to her side, the one Darian had given her not long ago. It felt heavier than usual. She had seen blood before, but this was different. This wasn't just defense. This was war. Kalen appeared at the far end of the courtyard, flanked by Darian and Marcus, his second-in-command. His presence alone was enough to still the restless energy pulsing through the pack. Lira could feel it, the weight of his authority pressing down on everyone like a second skin. "Tonight," Kalen began, his voice cutting through the quiet, "we remind the Ironfangs that this land belongs to us." Murmurs rippled through the gathered wolves, but none dared to speak aloud. "They crossed our border," Kalen continued, his gaze sweeping over the pack. "And that mistake will cost them." Darian stepped forward, scanning the faces of the wolves who would join the hunt. "You know the rules," Darian said. "We move as one. No one breaks the line. No one acts alone." Kalen's gaze shifted toward Lira, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're coming with me," he said, and the murmurs died instantly. Lira blinked, unsure if she had misheard him. "What?" she asked softly. Kalen's eyes didn't waver. "You need to learn how this works," he replied. Lira hesitated. She could feel the stares pressing in on her from all sides. "I've never hunted before," she admitted. Kalen arched a brow. "Then tonight will be your first lesson." Lyra's chest tightened, but she didn't argue. The wolves dispersed shortly after, their movements blending into the shadows as they followed Kalen into the forest. Lira trailed behind, her steps light but uncertain. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the threat of the Ironfangs lurking in the woods, or the realization that a part of her wanted to see this through. The forest stretched endlessly beneath the moonlit sky, its branches casting jagged shadows along the narrow path ahead. Lira followed closely behind Kalen, her hand hovering near the dagger strapped to her waist. The air was cold, but sweat beaded at the back of her neck, adrenaline prickling beneath her skin. Kalen's wolves moved silently, their footsteps barely disturbing the fallen leaves. Lira tried to mimic their grace, but every snapped twig felt deafening in the quiet. Darian flanked the right side of the group, scanning the trees with practiced ease. "They're close," Kalen murmured, his voice low enough for only Lira to hear. Lyra's breath caught. "How can you tell?" Kalen's gaze flicked toward her briefly. "Instinct," he replied. "You'll learn." Before Lira could press further, Kalen raised his hand, signaling for the pack to halt. The wolves froze instantly, their eyes fixed on the tree ahead. Lira strained to see what they were watching, but the forest remained still. A cold breeze slipped through the branches, and for a brief moment, Lira thought she imagined the faint rustle of leaves, too soft to be the wind. Then she saw them. 3 figures emerging from the shadows. Ironfangs. Lyra's heart pounded as the tension thickened. Kalen's hand drifted toward his blade, his expression calm but deadly. Lira gripped the hilt of her dagger, her knuckles white against the leather. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew the hunt had already begun. The Ironfang wolves moved like ghosts, their figures barely distinguishable against the thick forest shadows. Lyra's heart pounded, her breath shallow as she tightened her grip on the dagger strapped to her hip. 3 wolves. It wasn't the size of the group that unnerved her, it was the confidence in their movements, the way they advanced without hesitation, as if they owned the ground they walked on. Kalen didn't move. He stood with the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike, his sharp eyes locked onto the figures emerging from the trees. Darian shifted slightly to Kalen's right, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his sword. But there was nothing casual in the way his muscles coiled beneath his skin, ready to snap into action. Lira forced herself to stay still, mirroring the wolves around her. She felt out of place, an unarmed traveler in the middle of a battlefield. The Ironfangs stopped just short of the clearing, their leader stepping forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair cropped close to his skull. Scars traced down his jawline, and his piercing amber eyes glinted faintly in the moonlight. Not Vaughn, but close enough to make Lyra's pulse spike. The man's gaze drifted over the gathered wolves, lingering on Kalen. A twisted grin pulled at his lips. "Kalen," the Ironfang said, his voice smooth but edged with mockery. "I thought you'd be sleeping by now." Kalen's eyes remained cold and unreadable. "I don't sleep well when rats sneak into my territory." The Ironfang chuckled, his wolves shifting beside him with ease. "Rats," he echoed. "That's not very welcoming." "You crossed the river," Kalen replied, his tone sharp as a blade. "That's more warning than you deserve." The Ironfang's grin widened. "We're not here for a fight, Alpha," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Consider this a visit. Vaughn wanted to remind you he hasn't forgotten about that little piece of land he's been eyeing." Kalen's expression didn't change. "He can keep eyeing it from his side of the border." The Ironfang's eyes flickered, landing squarely on Lira. Her chest tightened as his gaze crawled over her, lingering too long. "And who's this?" he asked, taking a step forward. "You've picked up a new pet?" Darian tensed, his hand shifting slightly on his blade. Lira felt her heart quicken, but she forced herself not to flinch. "She's none of your concern," Kalen said coldly. The Ironfang's grin didn't waver. "I'd say she is," he mused, eyes still fixed on her. "Vaughn mentioned a tribute from the rebellion. A daughter, wasn't it?" Lyra's breath caught. "So this is her," the Ironfang continued. "I expected more fire." Kalen took a single step forward, placing himself directly between Lira and the Ironfang. "You'll leave now," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Before I decide to send Vaughn a message in pieces." The air thickened, and for a brief, tense moment, Lira thought the Ironfang might refuse. His grin faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing as he weighed Kalen's threat. Finally, he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need for violence," the Ironfang said smoothly. "We'll leave. But tell me, Alpha, how long do you think you can keep her safe?" His amber eyes flicked toward Lira one last time. "Because sooner or later," he added, his voice barely above a whisper, "we'll be back for her." Lyra's pulse roared in her ears, but she stood still, refusing to let her fear show. The Ironfangs turned, slipping back into the shadows without another word. It wasn't until their footsteps faded completely that Lira exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The wolves around her eased slightly, but Kalen's gaze remained fixed on the trillion long after the Ironfangs were gone. Darian shifted beside him, scowling. "They're testing us," Darian muttered. "Seeing how far they can push before we break." Kalen's expression darkened. "They won't have to wonder much longer." Lira glanced between them, uncertainty curling tightly in her chest. "They're not going to stop," she murmured. Kalen finally turned to her, his gaze sharper than ever. "No," he said quietly. "They're not." Lyra's stomach twisted. "So what happens now?" Kalen's eyes glinted beneath the moonlight, cold and certain. "Now," he echoed, stepping toward her. "Now you stop pretending you can hide from this fight." Lira opened her mouth to respond, but the words died on her tongue. Kalen's gaze held her in place, fierce and unrelenting. "You saw how he looked at you," Kalen continued, his voice low but firm. "Vaughn wants you, Lira. And the longer you pretend to stay in the shadows, the easier it will be for them to take you." Lyra's breath quickened. "I'm not ready for this," she admitted softly. Kalen stepped closer, his hand brushing against the dagger at her waist. "No one ever is," he said. His fingers curled around hers, guiding her hand over the hilt. "But you will be." Lira met his gaze, and for the first time, she understood what he meant. This wasn't about power or strength. It was about survival. And whether she liked it or not, the wolves at her door weren't going to wait for her to be ready. They were coming. And when they did, Lira knew she wouldn't have the luxury of yielding. Chapter 9. The Blood That Binds Us. The fortress walls felt thinner after the Ironfangs' visit. Lira could sense the shift, subtle but unrelenting, like the faint tremor of approaching thunder. Vaughn's wolves had left the border, but their presence lingered like ghosts, haunting every corner of the stronghold. Kalen's pack had returned to their patrols, but they were restless, watching the trees with narrowed eyes and sharp edges. The air hung heavy with the weight of something inevitable, and Lira could feel it pressing down with every passing hour. She tightened the cloak around her shoulders, stepping through the corridor that led to the outer walls. Torches lined the stone path, their flickering flames casting distorted shadows that danced along the cold stone. She found Darian near the gate, leaning against the edge of the watchtower. His gaze was distant, fixed on the tree stretching beyond the fortress walls. "You're brooding again," Lira said softly, pulling the cloak tighter as she stepped beside him. Darian's lips twitched faintly, though his expression remained serious. "I'm thinking," he replied, glancing at her from the corner of his eye. "There's a difference." Lira arched a brow. "Is there?" Darian exhaled, his gaze returning to the darkened forest. "Brooding doesn't change anything. Thinking does." Lira leaned against the stone, following his gaze toward the distant ridge where the Ironfangs had been last seen. "Do you think they'll come back tonight?" she asked. Darian hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly against the hilt of his dagger. "They won't wait long," he admitted. "Vaughn doesn't have patience for drawn-out games. He'll want to test us again soon." Lyra's stomach tightened, the cold settling deeper into her bones. "They're after me," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Darian didn't deny it. "They think you're a weakness," he replied, his gaze sharpening. "But Kalen doesn't keep weaknesses around for long." Lira swallowed, her fingers brushing against the hidden dagger at her waist. "He thinks I'll change," she said softly. Darian's eyes flickered toward her, his expression unreadable. "He's not wrong." Before Lira could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Kalen emerged from the corridor, his presence sending a ripple of quiet authority through the space. He carried himself like a wolf that never let its guard down, each movement precise and deliberate. "You're both awake," Kalen said, his sharp gaze drifting between them. Darian nodded toward the forest. "Waiting for our visitors to return." Kalen's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Instead, his eyes shifted to Lira. "I need you to come with me," he said. Lira straightened, confusion flickering across her face. "Where?" Kalen turned toward the courtyard, motioning for her to follow. "There's something you need to see." The corridor twisted deeper into the fortress than Lira had ever gone before. The torches burned low here, casting long shadows that stretched along the walls like jagged scars. Kalen led the way in silence, his steps quiet against the cold stone. Lira followed closely behind, resisting the urge to ask questions. After several minutes, Kalen stopped before a heavy iron door set into the farthest corner of the fortress. Lira frowned. "What is this place?" she asked quietly. Kalen didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed his hand against the iron, and with a low groan, the door creaked open. Lira hesitated before stepping inside. The room beyond was small, but its contents stole the breath from her lungs. A large wooden table dominated the space, maps and faded parchments spread across its surface. Weapons lined the far wall, swords, daggers, and longbows polished to a deadly gleam. But it wasn't the weapons that caught her attention. It was the blood-stained armor resting on the farthest chair. Kalen closed the door behind them, sealing them inside the room. "This belonged to your father," he said quietly. Lyra's heart stopped. She stepped forward slowly, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. "I thought," Lyra's voice wavered. "I thought his things were destroyed after the rebellion." Kalen's gaze lingered on the armor, his expression hard to read. "Not everything," he replied. Lira exhaled shakily, her eyes locked on the faint markings etched along the chest plate, the crest of her family's lineage. "Why show me this now?" she asked, turning toward him. Kalen met her gaze, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face.
Because Vaughn knows who you are, he said.
And sooner or later, he'll use it against you. Lira swallowed the lump in her throat. I'm not my father, she whispered. Kalen stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. No, he agreed. But you carry his blood. And that's enough to make you dangerous. Lyra's fingers curled around the edge of the table, the weight of his words pressing heavily against her chest. I never wanted to be part of this, she admitted softly. Kalen's gaze softened, just barely. None of us did, he said. But the world doesn't care what we want. Lira forced herself to breathe, the cold air biting at her lungs. What happens now? She asked. Kalen's expression hardened once more. Now you stop running from it, he replied. His gaze flickered toward the door. Tomorrow, we leave the fortress, he said. I want you with me when we cross into the Northern Territory. Lyra's stomach twisted, but she nodded. She didn't know what waited for them beyond the border. But whatever it was, she wouldn't face it alone. Lira sat alone by the fire long after Kalen left. The armor remained where she had found it, silent and cold beneath the flickering torchlight. Her father's rebellion had failed. His blood had been spilled for a cause that died with him. And now, the wolves circling Kalen's borders believed she was the next piece to fall. Lira tightened her grip on the dagger at her waist, the blade cold against her palm. Not yet. The fire crackled softly, but she didn't turn away from the armor. She wasn't her father. But if the Ironfangs thought they could break her, they were wrong. The morning sun barely crept over the treetops as the fortress gates groaned open. The cold air bit at Lyra's skin, but she didn't flinch. Wrapped in a dark cloak, she followed Kalen and Darian as they led a small group of wolves beyond the safety of the stone walls. Kalen hadn't spoken much since the night before. His instructions had been clear. She was to join the patrol moving north, toward the edge of the Ironfang border. Lyra's hand drifted to the dagger at her hip. The weight of it felt heavier in the light of day. Kalen walked ahead, his posture straight and unyielding as if he carried the entire weight of the pack on his shoulders. Darian slowed his pace, falling into step beside her as they descended the rocky path leading into the dense woods. Nervous? He asked, casting a glance her way. Lira forced a breath through her nose. Should I be? Darian chuckled softly. Probably. Lyra's grip tightened around the hilt of her dagger. I thought Kalen didn't take unnecessary risks. Darian's eyes flicked toward Kalen's back. He doesn't, Darian replied. But this isn't about risk. It's about control. Lira frowned. Control? Darian lowered his voice. Vaughn knows exactly where our borders are. He's testing Kalen to see how far he'll let him push. Kalen doesn't plan to wait for the next test. He's pushing back. Lira exhaled sharply. And I'm part of that. Darian smirked faintly. You're the reason Vaughn's circling. Kalen wants to remind him you're not an easy prize to take. Her stomach tightened. I didn't ask to be part of this fight, she muttered, her fingers curling beneath her cloak. Darian glanced at her, his amber eyes softer than usual. No one ever does, he said. The forest stretched endlessly ahead, the narrow path winding between towering pines and twisted roots. The quiet hum of life stirred around them, the distant rustle of leaves, the faint chirping of unseen birds. But beneath it all, there was something else. A stillness. Lira felt it settle deep in her chest, tightening like a noose with every step they took. You feel it too, Kalen said from ahead, as if reading her thoughts. Lira blinked, startled by his sudden attention. He didn't turn to face her, but his voice carried easily through the silent woods. They're watching us, Kalen added. But they won't strike. Not yet. Lira glanced toward the shadows between the trees. I don't see anything, she admitted. Kalen's gaze shifted slightly. That's the point. The path narrowed as the group pressed forward, the canopy above blocking out more of the morning light. Lira stayed close to Kalen's side, her heart pounding quietly in her chest. Every step further from the fortress felt like crossing into unknown territory, the safety of stone walls shrinking behind her. After nearly an hour, the patrol came to a stop at the edge of a narrow stream that cut through the forest floor. Kalen raised his hand, signaling for silence. His gaze swept the surrounding area before settling on Lira. "You recognize this place?" he asked. Lira frowned, glancing around.
"No."
"Should I?" Kalen's expression darkened slightly. "This is where your father met Vaughn for the last time," he said. Lyra's breath caught. The stream trickled softly at their feet, but the weight of Kalen's words felt louder than the water. "My father fought here," she whispered. Kalen nodded. "This is where Vaughn betrayed the truce." Darian stepped forward, crouching near the stream's edge. His fingers brushed lightly against the dirt. "There are fresh tracks," Darian said quietly. "Not ours." Kalen's gaze narrowed. "How many?" Darian rose to his feet, brushing the dirt from his palms.
4.
"Maybe 5, Darian replied. "They crossed here last night." Lira shifted uneasily, her hand drifting toward the dagger at her waist. "Do you think they're still nearby?" she asked. Kalen's eyes didn't leave the treeline. "I hope so," he replied. "Because if Vaughn's sending wolves across the border again, this time they won't walk away." Lira swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. The forest suddenly felt much smaller. They followed the tracks for nearly an hour, weaving deeper into the northern woods. The faint trail led them through narrow, winding paths and dense foliage. Lyra's steps were careful, but her pulse quickened with each passing moment. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led somewhere. Kalen walked ahead, his gaze unwavering as he tracked the faint signs Vaughn's wolves had left behind. Darian followed closely beside her, his hand never far from the hilt of his weapon. The quiet was suffocating. "Kalen," Darian said suddenly, his voice low. Kalen stopped, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the forest ahead. Lira followed his gaze. At first, she didn't see anything. But then, a figure stood just beyond the ridge.
Tall.
Unmoving. Watching.
Vaughn.
Lyra's breath hitched, her heart slamming against her ribs. Kalen's hand instinctively went to his blade, but Vaughn didn't move. He remained on the opposite side of the border, his wolves lingering behind him like shadows in the undergrowth. For a long, tense moment, neither pack made a move. Lira could feel the weight of Vaughn's gaze, locking onto her. A cold smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Then, without a word, Vaughn raised his hand. His wolves melted back into the forest. Lyra's breath escaped in a slow, trembling exhale. "He's toying with us," Darian muttered, his grip tightening on his sword. Kalen's expression remained unreadable as he watched Vaughn disappear into the shadows. "No," Kalen said softly. "He's waiting." Lira glanced at him. "For what?" Kalen's eyes flickered toward her, his expression grim. "For you to make a mistake." Chapter 10: The Price of Defiance. The moon had barely risen when Lira returned to the fortress, but the weight of the encounter at the border pressed down on her like a cloak she couldn't remove. Vaughn's cold smile lingered in her thoughts long after he disappeared into the forest. She sat alone by the fire in the great hall, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea. The warmth did little to steady the trembling that crept into her bones. The Ironfangs weren't just testing the borders. They were testing her. Lira didn't know why that realization unsettled her more than the threat of war itself. She glanced at the shadows stretching along the stone walls, listening to the quiet crackle of the flames. The fortress had fallen into silence, save for the faint footsteps of guards patrolling the outer halls. Kalen hadn't said much after they returned. He retreated to his quarters without so much as a glance in her direction. Darian had stayed longer, but even he eventually left her alone by the fire, offering nothing but a brief nod before disappearing into the dark. Lira wasn't sure if their silence was meant to comfort her or remind her how little she understood the game being played around her. The truth was simple. Vaughn wanted her, and Kalen was willing to risk war to keep her out of his grasp.
But why?
Lira tightened her grip on the cup, frustration simmering beneath her skin. She wasn't a warrior. She wasn't a prize to be fought over. And yet, she sat in the middle of a battle she hadn't chosen, carrying the weight of a rebellion she never led. Her father's shadow stretched far, too far. And now, it threatened to consume her. The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall, pulling Lira from her thoughts. She looked up as Kalen emerged from the corridor, his expression unreadable as he crossed the room. Lira straightened, setting the cup aside as he approached. "You're still awake," Kalen said, his gaze flickering toward the dying embers in the hearth. "I could say the same about you," Lira replied softly. Kalen's lips twitched faintly, though no smile followed. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, his eyes fixed on the fire. "You shouldn't dwell on what happened tonight," he said, voice low. "Vaughn's games are designed to make you doubt yourself." Lira frowned. "Is that what he's doing? Playing games?" Kalen's gaze shifted to her, sharp and steady.
Yes.
"And you can't let him win." Lira exhaled slowly, brushing her hair over her shoulder. "I didn't ask for this, Kalen," she said, the frustration slipping into her voice. "I didn't ask to be part of whatever war is brewing between you and Vaughn." Kalen leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees as he studied her carefully. "You think I don't know that?" he asked quietly. "You think I wanted you here?" Lyra's eyes narrowed. "Then why am I here?" she pressed. Kalen's expression darkened, but he didn't look away. "Because you're part of this whether you accept it or not," he replied. "Vaughn sees you as a weakness, an easy way to unravel everything I've built. If I let him believe that, you'll never be safe." Lyra's chest tightened. "And if I leave?" she asked softly. "If I disappear?" Kalen cut her off with a sharp look. "He'll follow you," Kalen said. "And when he finds you, there won't be anyone left to stop him." Lira swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking deep into her bones. She lowered her gaze to the fire, watching as the flames flickered and died, leaving nothing but ash behind. "I don't want to be a weakness," Lira whispered. Kalen's voice softened, though the steel in it remained. "Then stop acting like one." The next morning came swiftly, dragging a heavy fog across the fortress grounds. Lira stood at the edge of the training yard, her breath clouding in the cold air as she watched the wolves sparring beneath the pale light. Kalen's words lingered in her mind, circling like vultures over carrion. "Stop acting like a weakness." She hated how much those words burrowed beneath her skin. Because he was right. If she wanted to survive this, truly survive, she couldn't keep pretending she didn't belong here. Lira stepped forward, gripping the hilt of the dagger strapped to her waist as she crossed the courtyard. Joran stood in the center of the ring, sparring with one of Kalen's wolves. His strikes were quick and calculated, each movement fluid as he drove his opponent back. Lira stopped at the edge of the ring, waiting until the fight ended before stepping inside. Joran arched a brow, wiping the sweat from his forehead as he turned to face her. "You're here early," he remarked, tossing his opponent aside with a nod. "I need to train," Lira replied, her voice steady. Joran smirked. "You sure about that?" Lira drew her dagger in response, the blade glinting faintly beneath the morning light. Joran's grin widened. "All right," he said, lowering into a ready stance. "Let's see if you've learned anything." The match began without warning. Joran lunged first, his blade cutting through the air with practiced ease. Lira barely dodged, twisting to the side as his strike skimmed past her shoulder. She countered quickly, but Joran parried with little effort, knocking her off balance. Lira gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay grounded as she circled him. "Stop hesitating," Joran growled. "You're holding back." Lyra's eyes narrowed. She wasn't holding back. She was surviving. Joran advanced again, his strikes faster this time. Lira met them with more confidence, blocking and pivoting as she forced him to adjust his footing. But the gap between their skills was obvious. Joran pressed forward, driving her toward the edge of the ring. Lyra's heel caught on a loose stone, and she stumbled, dropping to one knee. Joran stepped forward, raising his blade. Lyra's grip tightened. Before he could strike, she twisted low, sweeping his legs out from beneath him. Joran hit the ground hard, cursing under his breath. Lira rose quickly, her dagger hovering just inches from his throat. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Joran chuckled, raising his hands in surrender. "All right," he said, grinning up at her. "I stand corrected." Lira stepped back, lowering the blade as Joran climbed to his feet. "I'm not just standing here to be tested," she said quietly, brushing the hair from her face. Joran's grin faded, but there was something else in his eyes.
"Respect." "Good," he said.
"Because if Vaughn comes for you, you won't get the luxury of yielding." Lira met his gaze, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest.
"I know," she replied.
And this time she meant it. Lira stood at the edge of the training yard long after the sparring match had ended. Joran had left, but his words clung to her like smoke, sinking into the folds of her thoughts. "If Vaughn comes for you, you won't get the luxury of yielding." The weight of that truth settled in her chest, cold and heavy. She tightened the leather strap around the hilt of her dagger, the smooth handle fitting more comfortably in her palm now than it had days ago. Each spar, each stumble, and each bruise carved her into something harder, something sharper. But she wasn't there yet. Lira felt the difference between herself and Kalen's wolves like a jagged crack in the stone beneath her feet. They moved with instinct, their strength woven into the marrow of their bones. She was still learning to fight her own shadows. And shadows didn't bleed. A voice broke her thoughts. "You lasted longer this time." Lira glanced over her shoulder, finding Kalen leaning against the far pillar of the courtyard. His arms were crossed loosely, but his sharp gaze betrayed how long he'd been watching. Lira wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "Joran wasn't trying to kill me," she replied. "I doubt Vaughn's wolves will be so generous." Kalen's eyes flickered faintly in the fading light, but he didn't argue. "No," he admitted. "They won't." Lira exhaled, running her fingers along the edge of her blade. "Why did you bring me out here?" she asked, turning fully to face him. "Why not leave me inside the walls where it's safer?" Kalen pushed off the pillar, his footsteps echoing softly as he approached. "Because safe is temporary," he replied. "And I don't have time to protect someone who refuses to defend herself." His words weren't cruel, but they struck harder than any blow Joran had landed. Lira straightened, her grip tightening around the dagger. "I never asked you to protect me," she said quietly. Kalen stepped closer, his gaze narrowing as if weighing her words.
"No," he said.
"But you're in my territory. That makes you my responsibility, whether either of us likes it or not." Lira held his stare, refusing to look away. She could feel the weight behind his words, the same unrelenting pressure that followed every encounter they'd shared since the day she arrived. She wasn't just another wolf in the pack. She was something that could either strengthen him or break everything he'd built. Finally, Kalen's gaze softened, if only slightly. "Come with me," he said, nodding toward the fortress steps. Lira hesitated for a moment, but eventually followed. The path Kalen led her down wasn't one she recognized. The corridor twisted toward the lower levels of the fortress, where the stone walls grew colder and the torches burned dimmer. Lira trailed behind him, the echo of their footsteps the only sound breaking the silence. She wasn't sure how long they walked, but eventually Kalen stopped before a door reinforced with iron rivets. He pushed it open, stepping aside to let her enter first. Lira hesitated. "What is this?" she asked, peering into the room beyond. It wasn't large, barely more than a chamber carved from the rock beneath the fortress. But the moment she stepped inside, she felt it. The air was different here, heavier. Lira's gaze swept the room, landing on a single object at its center. A wooden rack stood against the far wall, and resting upon it was a long blade, black as onyx. Its edge gleamed faintly beneath the low torchlight, sharp and untouched by rust or age. She stepped closer, her fingertips grazing the hilt. It was lighter than she expected, yet the weight of it thrummed in her palm. "This was my father's," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Kalen nodded, leaning against the doorway. "I kept it after the rebellion," he said. "The others thought it should be destroyed, but I knew it might be useful one day." Lira traced the worn markings along the blade's spine, recognizing the faint crest etched into the steel, her family's sigil. "I thought you wanted to erase everything he built," she said, her gaze locked on the weapon. Kalen's expression darkened faintly. "I wanted to erase his rebellion," he replied. "But not his legacy." Lira turned toward him, confusion flickering in her eyes. There's a difference? Kalen's gaze met hers, cold and unwavering.
Yes, he said.
Because legacy isn't built by the choices of the dead. It's shaped by the ones who survive. Lyra's breath caught, her grip tightening on the blade. I'm not my father, she said softly. Kalen stepped closer, his presence looming over her like a shadow stretching beneath the torchlight. No, he murmured. You're not. But you're the only one left who carries his name. Lira lowered the blade, the weight of his words settling deep into her bones. The truth was undeniable. Whatever war had begun with her father's rebellion hadn't ended with his death. It had simply changed hands. The sun dipped below the horizon by the time Lira returned to her chambers, the blade still strapped to her side. She sat by the window, watching as the stars began to flicker faintly across the sky. The fortress below bustled with movement, wolves patrolling the outer walls, reinforcing the gates as if bracing for something inevitable. Vaughn's wolves were out there, just beyond the ridge. And Lira knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. Her father's blade felt colder against her thigh, its presence a constant reminder of the choices she could no longer avoid. She wasn't a warrior, but she couldn't stay a shadow forever. As the wind whispered through the cracks in the stone, Lyra's hand drifted toward the hilt, her fingers curling around it. She didn't know if she was ready to carry her father's legacy. But when the Ironfangs came, she would meet them empty-handed. Chapter 11. The Howl of the Ironfangs. The sky hung heavy with clouds, casting the fortress in muted shades of gray. Lira stood on the outer wall, her hands gripping the cold stone as she gazed into the forest beyond. The air felt different, thick with tension, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Kalen's pack moved in careful silence below, reinforcing the gates and patrolling the perimeter. Every wolf in the fortress could feel it. The Ironfangs weren't gone. They were waiting. Lira adjusted the sword strapped to her side. Her father's blade. It felt heavier than it had the night Kalen placed it in her hands, but she refused to let it weigh her down. Darian appeared beside her, leaning casually against the wall as if the looming threat of war didn't concern him. Don't suppose you slept? He asked, his amber eyes flicking toward her. Lira exhaled, shaking her head. Not much. Darian smirked faintly.
Good.
Sleep would have been a waste of time, anyway. Lyra's brow furrowed. You think they'll come tonight? Darian's gaze drifted to the distant treetops. I think they'll come when it's inconvenient for us. Vaughn isn't the type to attack head-on. He'll wait until we're tired. Distracted? Lira tightened her grip on the stone ledge, her knuckles pale against the cold. I don't understand him, she admitted.
Vaughn.
Why does he care about me so much? I'm not a threat to him. Darian's smirk faded, his gaze sharpening. You're not a threat, he agreed. But you're leverage. Vaughn doesn't need to kill you to win. He just needs to pull you out of Kalen's reach. Lira swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking into her chest. So this isn't about me at all, she murmured. Darian hesitated, then nodded. Not entirely, he replied. It's about power. You're just the easiest way to tip the scales. Lyra's stomach twisted. She turned her gaze back to the forest, searching for movement between the trees. I hate this, she whispered. Being hunted like prey. Darian's hand drifted toward the hilt of his dagger, his eyes narrowing. Then stop being prey. Lira glanced at him, but Darian's attention was elsewhere. His gaze had locked onto something along the far ridge, just beyond the border. Lira followed his line of sight, but the woods remained still. What is it? She asked, her voice tense. Darian didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Movement, he muttered. Lira strained to see, her heart pounding softly in her chest. For a moment, the forest seemed empty. Then, a figure shifted between the trees, their silhouette barely visible against the darkening sky. Lyra's breath caught. More followed. One by one, the Ironfangs emerged from the shadows, their dark forms weaving between the trees like smoke curling beneath the moon. Darian, Lyra's voice faltered. I see them, he muttered. The wolves didn't approach the fortress, but they lingered along the edge of the border, watching. Waiting. Darian stepped back from the ledge. "Go find Kalen," he said, his tone sharp.
Now?
Lira hesitated. "You don't think they'll attack, do you?" Darian's gaze flickered to hers, the faintest edge of worry in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'd rather not wait to find out." Lira didn't argue. She turned, moving quickly along the outer wall as her pulse hammered in her ears. The Ironfangs weren't hiding anymore. Whatever Vaughn had planned, it was starting. She found Kalen in the lower courtyard, his eyes fixed on the line of wolves sharpening blades near the training yard. "Kalen," Lira called, hurrying to his side. He glanced at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "What is it?" Lira stopped, catching her breath.
"They're at the border," she said.
"Vaughn's wolves." Darian's watching them now. Kalen's gaze flickered, but his expression didn't change.
"They won't cross," he replied.
Lira frowned. "How can you be sure?" Kalen's eyes narrowed faintly. "Because they're not ready yet," he said. "Vaughn doesn't lead from the shadows. When he's ready to fight, he'll make sure we know it." Lira exhaled, frustration simmering beneath her skin. "So we just wait?" she asked, crossing her arms. Kalen stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "No," he said quietly. "We prepare." Lira held his stare, searching for something beneath the mask he wore so well. But there was nothing. Just the cold, unrelenting certainty of an alpha who had seen too many battles to doubt his instincts. "Come with me," Kalen said, turning toward the fortress. Lira hesitated for a brief moment before following him inside. The war room sat at the heart of the fortress, its stone walls lined with maps, old weapons, and faded banners. The air felt heavier here, thick with the weight of decisions made long before Lira arrived. Kalen stepped to the far table, spreading out a map of the northern border. Lira hovered near the entrance, watching as he traced the edge of the forest with his fingertips. "They're not after the fortress," Kalen said, his voice calm.
"Not yet."
Lira frowned. "Then what are they waiting for?" Kalen's eyes flickered toward her. "They're waiting for you to make a mistake." Lira's chest tightened. "I'm not going to run," she said firmly. Kalen's gaze lingered, his expression softening, just barely. "I know," he replied. "But Vaughn doesn't." Lira swallowed, stepping closer to the table. "So what do we do?" Kalen glanced down at the map, his hand drifting toward the ridge near the eastern pass. "We take the fight to them," he said. Lira stiffened. "What?" Kalen straightened, meeting her gaze. "We can't sit behind these walls forever," he said. "Vaughn's wolves are circling because they think we're afraid. It's time to remind them that we're not." Lira exhaled slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. She tightened her grip on the hilt of her sword. The Ironfangs were waiting, and if Kalen was right, they wouldn't have to wait much longer. Lira followed Kalen deeper into the war room, her footsteps echoing against the stone floor. The flickering lanterns hanging from the walls cast jagged shadows across the map stretched over the table, each border drawn in bold, precise lines. Kalen's hand traced the edge of the northern boundary, his fingertips hovering just above the tree line marking Ironfang territory. His expression was hard, unreadable. Lira stepped closer, the weight of the sword at her hip grounding her in the quiet. "You're really going to lead a patrol across the border?" she asked, breaking the silence. Kalen didn't look up. "We can't defend this fortress forever," he replied. "Vaughn's testing our limits, waiting for us to grow complacent. If we let him believe we're afraid, he'll strike." Lira frowned, her fingers tightening around the back of the chair beside her. But crossing into his territory, she hesitated. Isn't that exactly what he wants? Kalen's sharp gaze lifted, pinning her in place. "He wants to lure us out," Kalen admitted. "But Vaughn thrives on the element of surprise. I'm not giving him that advantage." Lira shifted uneasily, tracing the edge of the map with her fingertip. "If we cross the border, it won't just be a skirmish," she said softly. "It'll be war." Kalen's eyes narrowed faintly, but he didn't deny it. "You've been on this side of war before," Kalen murmured, watching her closely. Lira stiffened at the reminder. Her father's rebellion still loomed like a dark cloud over her head, his shadow stretching far beyond the grave. "I've seen what war does to people," Lira said, her voice quieter. "It doesn't just burn the enemy. It burns everything." Kalen leaned over the table, resting his palms against the wood as he studied her with those sharp, unrelenting eyes. "And yet, you're still standing." Lira met his gaze, something flickering in the space between them. "I don't want to see more blood spilled because of me," she said firmly. Kalen's expression shifted, softening at the edges, but the steel in his voice remained. "It's not about you, Lira," he replied. "This fight was coming long before you arrived at my gates. Vaughn has been circling for years. You've simply become a reason for him to move faster." Lira exhaled slowly, pressing her hand flat against the map. "And what if I wasn't here?" she asked quietly. "Would things be different?" Kalen stepped around the table, closing the space between them with slow, deliberate steps. "No," he said, his voice low. "But I wouldn't have someone to watch my back." Lyra's breath caught, but she kept her gaze steady. "You trust me to do that?" Kalen's eyes lingered on her, his presence as heavy as the blade strapped to her waist. "I trust you to try," he replied. It wasn't exactly the answer she wanted, but it was enough. Lira glanced down at the map, her gaze drifting toward the markers symbolizing Ironfangs scouts along the eastern ridge. "How many wolves are coming with us?" she asked, shifting gears. Kalen stepped back toward the table, rolling up the map with swift precision. 5, including Darian, he answered. "Small enough to move unnoticed, but enough to handle whatever we find." Lira arched a brow. "And if Vaughn sends more than 5? Kalen's lips twitched faintly. "Then we'll make them regret it." The patrol left the fortress before dawn, their figures vanishing into the dense forest beneath the cover of darkness. Lira rode beside Kalen, the cold morning air biting at her skin as they followed the narrow path winding toward the northern ridge. Darian and 2 other wolves trailed behind them, their movements silent but watchful. Lira shifted uneasily in her saddle, the weight of her father's blade bouncing against her thigh with each step. She wasn't sure if the blade comforted her or reminded her of everything she had to lose. Kalen's gaze flicked toward her, catching the tension in her shoulders. "You don't have to come," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind. Lira glanced at him, shaking her head. "I know," she replied. "But I'm not staying behind." Kalen didn't argue. They rode for over an hour, the forest growing denser as they neared the border. The morning light bled slowly through the branches, casting faint shadows across the frost-covered ground. Lira felt the shift in the air the moment they crossed into Ironfang territory. The trees felt closer, the silence heavier. Darian pulled his horse to a stop, glancing over his shoulder. "Tracks," he murmured, dismounting near the edge of the ridge. Kalen and Lira followed, their boots sinking into the cold earth as they approached the faint trail of paw prints cutting through the undergrowth. "They're fresh," Darian added, crouching beside the tracks. His fingers brushed the dirt, sifting the loose soil beneath his palm. Lira knelt beside him, tracing the outline of the prints with her fingertips. "There's more than one set," she said, her voice hushed. Darian nodded. They were moving fast. Probably scouts. Kalen stepped closer, his gaze scanning the distant tree line. "They're hunting something," he murmured. Lira's brow furrowed. "Hunting?" Kalen's gaze darkened. "They wouldn't send scouts this far south unless they were chasing someone," he replied. Lira's stomach twisted. "What if it's us they're hunting?" she asked. Kalen met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Then they'll find more than they bargained for." They tracked the prints for over an hour, following the narrow path winding deeper into the northern woods. Lira kept close to Kalen's side, her hand never drifting far from the hilt of her blade. The tracks grew fainter as they climbed the ridge, but the unease settling over the patrol only deepened. Kalen slowed his pace, raising his hand for silence as they reached the top of the hill. Lira crept forward carefully, peering through the dense foliage below. Her breath caught in her throat. A small camp rested at the base of the hill, hidden between the trees. 3 Ironfang wolves lingered near the fire, their weapons resting beside them. Lira glanced at Kalen, waiting for a signal. Kalen's eyes narrowed as he studied the camp, his hand drifting toward the hilt of his sword. "Quiet," he whispered. "We take them before they can run." Lyra's heart pounded as she gripped her blade, the cold steel humming beneath her palm. The hunt had begun. Chapter 12. Beneath the Hunter's Moon. Lira crouched low behind the thick undergrowth, the cold metal of her father's blade pressing against her thigh. The faint crackle of the Ironfangs' campfire drifted up the ridge, masking the soft shuffle of her boots against fallen leaves. Kalen moved ahead of her, his steps soundless, every inch of him coiled like a predator ready to strike. The 3 Ironfang scouts below hadn't noticed them yet. They sat around the fire, their laughter quiet but careless, weapons resting within arm's reach. Darien knelt beside Lira, bow strung across his back. His amber eyes flicked toward her, studying her grip on the dagger. "You're tense," he whispered, his voice barely audible.
Relax.
"Tension makes your strikes sloppy." Lira exhaled slowly, easing her grip. The weight of the blade no longer felt foreign in her hands, but that didn't make the thought of using it easier. "They haven't seen us," she murmured, glancing at Kalen. "We could avoid this fight." Darien's lips twitched in faint amusement. "That's not how this works," he replied. "They crossed into our land. We send them back in pieces." Lira frowned, her stomach twisting. Kalen signaled from ahead, motioning for Darien and Lira to flank left. Joran and another wolf took the right, circling the far side of the camp like silent shadows. Lira followed Darien's lead, creeping through the underbrush. Her pulse pounded louder with every step, but she forced herself forward, gripping the dagger until her knuckles turned white. The Ironfang closest to her stretched lazily, tossing another log onto the fire. His back was turned, his guard down. Kalen's voice echoed softly in her mind. "Strike fast. Don't hesitate. The moment you hesitate is the moment you die." Lira shifted her stance, the dagger's edge reflecting faintly in the firelight. She wasn't ready. But war didn't wait for readiness. Darien moved first, striking low and fast. His blade caught the first Ironfang across the throat before the wolf even realized he was under attack. Blood sprayed across the fire, hissing as it met the flames. The second wolf lunged to his feet, fumbling for the sword at his side. Lira moved instinctively, slipping behind him as he drew his blade. She drove the dagger into his side, twisting hard. The Ironfang howled, dropping his sword as he crumpled to the ground. Lira stumbled back, her chest heaving. The third wolf bolted, tearing through the woods in an attempt to escape. Kalen's blade flashed beneath the moonlight. The fleeing wolf hit the ground, his lifeless body falling at the edge of the camp. Silence followed, save for the soft crackle of the dying fire. Lira stood frozen, her chest rising and falling as she stared down at the wolf she had killed. Blood soaked the earth beneath his body, staining her boots. She felt Darien's eyes on her. "You did well," he said quietly, sheathing his blade. Lira didn't respond. Her heart pounded violently in her chest, but she kept her gaze locked on the dead Ironfang. She wasn't ready for the weight of killing, but the blood on her hands told her she didn't have a choice. They buried the bodies beneath the cover of trees, far from the campfire's reach. Kalen stood at the edge of the clearing, his sharp gaze fixed on the distant tree-line. "They won't stay quiet for long," he murmured. "When Vaughn realizes his scouts aren't returning, he'll send more." Darien wiped his hands clean, stepping beside him. "Then we'll be ready." Kalen's gaze flicked toward Lira, lingering on the faint tremble in her shoulders. She still hadn't spoken. "Lira," Kalen called softly. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "You did what you had to," he said, his voice calm but firm. Lira tightened her grip on the dagger, glancing back at the disturbed earth where the bodies lay hidden. "I know," she whispered, but the weight didn't feel any lighter. By the time they returned to the fortress, dawn painted the horizon in streaks of gold and gray. Lira walked in silence, trailing behind the others as they passed through the gates. The other wolves barely glanced their way, but she could feel their eyes following her as if they sensed the blood on her hands. Kalen dismissed the patrol without a word, but as Lira turned to leave, his voice stopped her. Stay. Lira hesitated, watching as Darian and Joran disappeared into the eastern wing. She turned back to Kalen, uncertainty flickering in her gaze. Why? She asked quietly. Kalen leaned against the stone pillar, his eyes scanning the quiet courtyard.
You didn't hesitate, he said.
Lyra's breath caught in her throat. I thought I would, she admitted, stepping closer. I thought I'd freeze. Kalen's gaze shifted to her, softer now. But you didn't. Lyra's grip tightened around the hilt of the dagger. No, she whispered. Kalen watched her for a long moment before stepping forward, his hand brushing against hers as he gently pried the blade from her grip. You can't carry this weight alone, he said quietly. Lira met his gaze, her heart pounding beneath his touch. I'm not alone, she replied. Kalen's eyes darkened, but he didn't look away. No, he agreed softly. You're not. The tension between them hung heavy in the air, but neither of them moved. Lira finally exhaled, stepping back. I need to rest, she murmured. Kalen nodded. Go, he said. But don't forget what happened tonight. Lira paused at the edge of the courtyard, glancing over her shoulder. I won't, she replied. But as she disappeared into the fortress halls, she wondered if she'd ever be able to forget. The wolves were at her heels now, and the blood she spilled tonight would only draw them closer. Lira couldn't sleep. The weight of the dagger still lingered in her palm, even though Kalen had taken it from her hours ago. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling of her chamber, but the flickering lantern shadows reminded her of the firelight at the Ironfang camp, reminded her of the moment her blade slipped between the ribs of a wolf who hadn't even known she was there. She had killed him. She told herself she had no choice. But that didn't quiet the memory of his gasp or the dull thud of his body hitting the ground. Pushing the blankets aside, Lira rose from bed, the cold floor biting at her bare feet. She crossed the room, leaning against the narrow window that overlooked the outer wall of the fortress. The forest stretched beyond the border, dark and vast beneath the waning moon. Somewhere out there, Vaughn would know his scouts hadn't returned. The next time they met, it wouldn't be just 3 wolves by a fire.
It would be war.
A soft knock pulled her from her thoughts. Lira turned, brushing strands of hair from her face as she opened the door. Darian stood in the corridor, arms crossed casually over his chest. His eyes flicked over her, noting the restless shadows beneath her gaze. Can't sleep? He asked. Lira shook her head. Darian didn't seem surprised. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door softly behind him. I thought I'd find you up, he said, leaning against the edge of the wooden table at the center of the room. Lira crossed her arms, tilting her head. You checking up on me? Darian smirked faintly. Kalen asked me to. Lira sighed, pressing her back against the stone wall. Of course he did. Darian studied her quietly for a moment, the faint amusement fading from his eyes. It doesn't get easier, he said softly. The first kill. Lira stiffened. I know. Darian's gaze drifted to the small dagger still resting on her bedside table, the steel catching faint traces of lantern light. But you handled it, he added. Lira glanced at him, uncertain how to respond. Barely, she admitted. Darian shrugged. Barely is enough. The wolves we buried tonight won't care how well you fought. Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line. I keep thinking about it, she said, her voice softer. His face. His voice before I... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Darian straightened, his expression unreadable. You think too much, he replied. Lira frowned. That's not exactly comforting, she muttered. Darian's amber eyes flicked toward her, his smirk returning, but it didn't last. Look, he said, his tone gentler now. We all carry ghosts. Every wolf here remembers the first life they took. The only difference between them and you, he paused, his gaze locking onto hers, is that they don't let it show. Lira swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in her chest. Is that supposed to be advice? She asked quietly. Darian stepped closer, his voice lowering. It's survival. They stood in silence for a long moment, the flicker of the lantern casting faint light across the room. Lira exhaled, brushing her hair behind her ear. I never wanted to survive like this, she admitted. Darian's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he finally nodded. None of us did, he replied. Before Lira could respond, a sharp knock echoed from the door. This time, when she opened it, Kalen stood waiting. His dark eyes flicked to Darian, noting his presence but saying nothing. Come with me, Kalen said, his voice low and even. Lira arched a brow, glancing between the two of them. Now, she asked, eyeing the dark corridor behind him. It's the middle of the night. Kalen didn't flinch. That's the point. Lira followed Kalen through the fortress, the cold air settling into her bones as they stepped out into the courtyard. Darian trailed behind them, his presence silent but unwavering. The fortress grounds were empty save for a few wolves stationed near the perimeter. Kalen led them toward the far side of the training yard, where torches burned low along the stone wall. Lira shivered, gripping her cloak tighter as they approached the sparring ring. I didn't think this was about training, Lira said cautiously, eyeing the empty yard. It's not, Kalen replied, stepping into the ring. He motioned for Lira to follow. Darian stopped at the edge, leaning against the post. Kalen's gaze locked onto her, his sharp eyes glinting beneath the torchlight. Draw your blade, he ordered. Lira hesitated. What? Kalen's voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Draw it, he repeated.
Now.
Lira's heart pounded, but she obeyed, unsheathing her father's sword with slow precision. The steel gleamed faintly beneath the moonlight. Kalen stepped forward, his own blade already drawn. You killed one of Vaughn's wolves today, Kalen said, circling her slowly. Lira's grip tightened on the hilt. I know. Kalen's eyes narrowed. Show me. Lira's stomach twisted.
What?
Kalen didn't stop moving. Show me how you did it, he pressed. Lira glanced at Darian, but he didn't intervene. His gaze remained steady, as if silently agreeing with whatever Kalen intended. Lira exhaled shakily, lifting the blade in front of her. I caught him off guard, she admitted. He wasn't paying attention. Kalen's eyes darkened. That won't happen next time. In one swift motion, Kalen lunged. Lira barely had time to raise her sword before his blade crashed against hers. The impact rattled through her arms, driving her back a step. Kalen didn't relent, pressing forward with quick, calculated strikes. Lira scrambled to block, but his strength forced her to retreat. Strike faster, Kalen growled. Lira gritted her teeth, slashing at him with a quick, desperate motion. Kalen sidestepped, knocking her blade aside with ease. You hesitate, he said coldly. Lira's chest heaved, frustration curling beneath her skin. Because you're not trying to kill me, she snapped. Kalen's blade dropped slightly, but his eyes never softened. Then imagine I am, he replied. Lira's breath caught, but this time, she didn't hesitate. She lunged. Chapter 13. The Heart of the Wolf. Lira's blade clashed against Kalen's with a sharp ring that echoed across the courtyard. Her muscles burned with exertion, but she didn't step back. She couldn't.
Not now.
Kalen's strikes were relentless, his sword moving with fluid precision, as if he already knew every mistake she would make. His eyes stayed locked onto hers, not with malice, but with the cold calculation of someone determined to break through every wall she had left. Lira twisted away from his next strike, lowering into a crouch as she slashed at his side. Kalen deflected the blow easily, spinning behind her and bringing his blade up to rest against her shoulder. Dead, Kalen said, his voice calm. Lira cursed under her breath, stepping out of his reach and wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. I'm trying, she muttered. You're holding back, Kalen replied, lowering his blade but not sheathing it. He circled her slowly, watching every movement with a gaze sharp enough to cut through bone. That hesitation will kill you faster than Vaughn ever could. Lira gripped her sword tighter, the hilt pressing hard against her palm. I've fought before, she argued. I know how to defend myself. Kalen's eyes narrowed. Defense won't save you when the Ironfangs come. Lira clenched her jaw, biting back the retort rising to her lips. You said I didn't hesitate at the camp, she pointed out. Kalen stepped closer, lowering his voice. Because they didn't see you coming. Lyra's breath hitched. Kalen leaned in slightly, his presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. The moment Vaughn sends wolves that know who you are, Kalen said softly, they won't turn their backs to you. And you won't have the luxury of surprise. Lira swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I understand. Kalen watched her for a long moment before finally lowering his sword. Do you? He asked quietly. Because understanding isn't enough. You'll need to be faster, sharper, ruthless. Lyra's heart pounded as his words settled in the cold space between them. I don't want to become like Vaughn, she whispered. Kalen's eyes softened, just barely. You won't, he replied. But if you don't fight like him, you won't survive him. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on her chest, but she nodded. Again, Kalen said. Lira tightened her grip on the sword, stepping into the ring. This time, she wouldn't hold back. By the time they stopped, the sun had begun to rise, streaking pale light across the distant horizon. Lyra's arms ached, but she stood tall, her breath shallow but steady. Kalen lowered his blade, stepping back as Darian approached from the edge of the courtyard. She's improving, Darian observed, crossing his arms as he leaned against the stone pillar. Or, at least, she's still standing. Kalen sheathed his sword with a faint nod. She's learning. Lira rolled her shoulders, wincing at the stiffness settling into her muscles. I think I'd learn better if you didn't try to kill me every 5 minutes, she muttered, rubbing her sore wrist. Kalen arched a brow. You'd be dead if I was trying. Lira shot him a glare, but Darian chuckled. You'll thank him when the time comes, Darian said. Lira wasn't convinced, but she didn't argue. Kalen glanced at the gate, his gaze darkening as if his mind had already shifted to the next battle. They'll come soon, he said. Tonight, maybe tomorrow. Vaughn won't wait long. Darian's smirk faded. I know, Darian replied. Lyra's stomach twisted at the certainty in their voices. And when he does? She asked. Kalen's eyes met hers, steady and unrelenting. Then we make sure he regrets crossing the border. The fortress stirred with quiet urgency as preparations for Vaughn's inevitable attack continued. Wolves patrolled the outer walls, reinforcing the perimeter and sharpening weapons beneath the pale morning sky. Lira sat beneath the watchtower, running a whetstone along the edge of her blade, listening to the distant hum of the fortress coming alive around her. Jorn approached, crouching beside her as she worked. I heard you sparred with Kalen this morning, Jorn said, smirking faintly.
Brave.
Most of us avoid that kind of punishment. Lira glanced at him, arching a brow. Someone has to keep him sharp, she replied. Jorn laughed, but the humor didn't quite reach his eyes. You're not afraid of him, are you? He asked. Lira hesitated.
No, she admitted.
I'm afraid of what's coming. Jorn's smirk faded as he nodded. You're not alone in that. They sat in silence for a moment, the faint scrape of metal against stone filling the air between them. Do you think we can hold them off? Lira asked softly, glancing toward the northern gate. Jorn followed her gaze, his expression hardening. We don't have a choice, he replied. We fight or we fall. Lyra's grip tightened around the blade. I won't let them take this place, she said firmly. Jorn glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting faintly. Good, he replied. Because Kalen's betting on you more than he lets on. Lyra's breath caught, but before she could respond, the howl of a distant wolf pierced the air. Jorn stiffened, his hand drifting toward the dagger at his belt. Lira rose to her feet, her heart pounding. The howl wasn't one of Kalen's wolves. Darian appeared on the wall above, his eyes locked onto the distant treeline. They're here, he said. Lyra's blood turned to ice. Vaughn's wolves had come. The fortress gates locked behind them as Kalen's pack gathered in the courtyard, weapons drawn. Lira stood beside Darian, the weight of her father's blade resting against her hip. The northern ridge swarmed with shadows, figures shifting between the trees. Kalen stepped forward, his expression calm but deadly as he addressed his wolves. Vaughn's come for blood, Kalen said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Let's make sure it's his. A low growl echoed from the wolves gathered behind him. Lira tightened her grip on her sword, the cold air biting at her skin. She wasn't ready for this fight. But as Vaughn's wolves crept closer, she realized it didn't matter. The fight was already here. The wolves of Kalen's pack lined the fortress walls like statues, their silhouettes blending into the stone as Vaughn's Ironfangs crept from the shadows of the northern treeline. Lyra's breath misted in the cold air as she stood just behind Kalen, her father's blade heavy at her side. Darien flanked her, his bow already notched and aimed toward the advancing figures. The distant howls had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that wrapped around the fortress like a noose. Lira strained to count the shapes slipping between the trees. Too many. She glanced toward Kalen, searching for any flicker of doubt in his expression. There was none. His eyes remained locked on the forest ahead, his grip firm on the hilt of his sword. "This isn't a full attack," Kalen said quietly, as if sensing her thoughts. "They're feeling us out." Lira swallowed, her pulse quickening. "They're testing the walls," Darien added, his voice low. "Standard tactic. Vaughn's waiting to see how strong we are before he commits his full force." Lyra's hand tightened on the hilt of her blade. "If we know that, why not attack first?" she asked. Kalen's gaze flicked toward her, sharp and unyielding. "Because the hunter who springs too early loses the prey," he replied. "We let them come to us." Lira opened her mouth to argue but stopped as Vaughn stepped from the trees. He emerged with the slow confidence of someone who knew he wasn't in danger. His dark cloak flowed behind him, and his eyes gleamed beneath the pale light. 6 wolves flanked him, silent, deadly shadows. Vaughn's gaze swept the fortress, lingering briefly on Kalen before settling on Lira. Her heart stuttered in her chest, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. The corner of Vaughn's mouth twitched upward. "Is this the welcome I get?" Vaughn called, his voice smooth but loud enough to echo off the stone walls. "No banners? No feast?" "I'm disappointed, Kalen." Kalen remained still, his eyes cold. "You crossed the river," Kalen said. "I don't throw feasts for trespassers." Vaughn laughed, the sound low and unsettling. "Oh, I haven't crossed the river," Vaughn replied, gesturing to the ground beneath his feet. "I'm standing exactly where I should be. Your borders are in question." Lira felt the tension ripple through the pack. Darien's grip on his bow tightened. "You lost the right to question anything when you spilled blood on this land," Kalen growled. "Take your wolves and leave before I give you another scar to match the last one." Vaughn's eyes flashed with something cold and dangerous. He took a slow step forward. "You've grown soft," Vaughn said, his gaze shifting back to Lira. "Or maybe just sentimental." Lira's stomach twisted. "Careful, Vaughn," Kalen warned, stepping in front of Lira, his voice a growl now. "She isn't yours to threaten." Vaughn's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to threaten her," Vaughn replied, his voice soft but deadly. "She's already marked. The rebellion left its scent on her blood, and every wolf in this forest can smell it." Lira stiffened, her hand gripping the blade at her side. Kalen didn't move, his stance blocking Vaughn's view of her entirely. "This is your final warning," Kalen said. "Step back, or I'll consider this an act of war." Vaughn's smirk didn't fade, but his eyes hardened. "You're already at war, Kalen," Vaughn replied, his voice a whisper beneath the wind. "You just haven't accepted it yet." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, with a slow gesture, Vaughn turned and motioned for his wolves to retreat. They melted back into the trees like shadows slipping beneath the earth. Lira exhaled, the tension coiling in her chest slowly loosening as Vaughn's figure disappeared from view. Kalen lowered his sword, but didn't relax. Darien lowered his bow with a soft curse. "He's toying with us," Darien muttered, stepping closer. "He's watching," Kalen corrected, his gaze still fixed on the treeline. "And he won't stop until he's convinced there's no weakness to exploit." Lira swallowed hard, the weight of Kalen's words sinking deep into her bones. She wasn't sure if he was talking about the fortress or her. Lira found herself pacing the upper balcony of the fortress long after the sun had set. The fire in the courtyard below crackled faintly, but the cold still seeped into her skin. Kalen stood nearby, leaning against the railing, his gaze scanning the dark forest beyond the walls. "You should be resting," he said without looking at her. Lira crossed her arms, stepping closer. "So should you?" Kalen's lips twitched faintly, though the humor didn't reach his eyes. "I rest when I know Vaughn is gone," he replied. Lyra's gaze drifted toward the distant treetops. "You think he'll come back soon?" Kalen's jaw tightened. "I know he will." Silence hung between them for a long moment. Lira finally broke it. "Why does Vaughn hate you so much?" she asked. Kalen's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't turn. "I took something from him," Kalen said quietly. Lyra's brow furrowed.
What?
Kalen finally met her gaze, his expression hard. "Power." Lira hesitated. "Was he ever stronger than you?" she asked softly. Kalen's gaze lingered on her, but something flickered behind his eyes. "No," he replied. "But Vaughn doesn't need to be stronger to be dangerous. He just needs to be patient." Lira swallowed hard, her grip tightening against the railing. "So what do we do?" she whispered. Kalen's gaze flicked to the distant woods, his eyes glinting beneath the moonlight. "We don't give him the chance to strike first," he said. Lyra's chest tightened. The wolves would return. And this time, they wouldn't stop at the border. Chapter 14: The Edge of the Blade. The fortress pulsed with quiet urgency. Morning light filtered through the mist that clung to the outer walls, and the wolves of Kalen's pack moved with grim focus. Spears lined the armory, bows were strung, and blades sharpened. The sound of steel on stone echoed faintly across the training yard as preparations for war continued. Lira stood at the edge of the northern wall, watching the treeline where Vaughn's wolves had retreated the night before. Her hand drifted to the hilt of her father's blade, the weight of it grounding her against the cold wind. She hadn't slept. Neither had Kalen. Below, Darian directed a group of wolves reinforcing the outer gate. His voice carried across the yard, sharp and authoritative, but when his gaze lifted, he found Lira watching. He joined her moments later, stepping onto the wall with a quiet ease that only seasoned warriors carried. "You're brooding," Darian said, leaning against the stone beside her. Lira arched a brow. "I thought brooding was Kalen's specialty." Darian smirked faintly. "He's rubbing off on you?" Lira exhaled, her eyes scanning the trees. "They're still out there," she murmured. Darian's gaze shifted toward the woods, narrowing slightly. "They are," he admitted. "But they're waiting for something." Lira frowned. What could they possibly be waiting for? Vaughn made it clear he doesn't care about the rules of war. Darian's jaw tightened. "He doesn't," he agreed. "But Vaughn isn't reckless. He's patient. He knows this game better than most." Lira crossed her arms, the cold seeping through her cloak. "That's what Kalen said," she murmured. "That Vaughn's waiting for an opening." Darian's eyes flicked toward her, and for a moment, his expression softened. "He's not wrong," Darian said quietly. Lira shifted beneath his gaze. "But what if I'm the opening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Darian didn't answer immediately. His silence was more telling than any words. Lira gritted her teeth, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "I won't let Vaughn use me to bring this fortress down," she said firmly. Darian studied her carefully. "No one expects you to," he replied. Lira glanced down at the wolves in the courtyard, the weight of their preparation pressing down on her like a second skin. "I should be doing more," she muttered. "Not just standing here, watching." Darian arched a brow. "You fought in the woods," he reminded her. "You've already done more than most would in your position." Lyra's gaze hardened. "Not enough." Darian pushed off the stone, stepping in front of her. "You'll get your chance soon," he said quietly. "Trust me." Lira exhaled, brushing the hair from her face. "I hope you're right." Kalen stood at the far end of the courtyard, his eyes sharp as he oversaw the patrols moving beyond the gates. His expression was unreadable, but Lira had come to recognize the way tension coiled in his posture whenever Vaughn's wolves lingered too close. Lira approached, falling into step beside him. "Any sign of them?" she asked. Kalen's gaze flicked toward the treeline. "Not since last night," he replied. Lira frowned. "That doesn't mean they're gone." Kalen's lips pressed into a thin line.
They're not, he said.
They're waiting. Lira hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. You think I'm why Vaughn hasn't attacked yet, she said quietly. Kalen's eyes met hers, unwavering. You're part of the reason, he admitted. Lira's stomach twisted. I could leave, she suggested, though the words felt heavier as she spoke them. If I'm the reason he's circling the fortress, maybe I shouldn't be here. Kalen's gaze darkened. That won't stop him, Kalen replied. Vaughn doesn't want just you. He wants everything you represent. The moment you step beyond these walls, you'll be hunted. Lira clenched her fists at her sides, but Kalen's voice softened slightly. I know you think running will save them, he said. But this isn't your fight to carry alone. Lira exhaled slowly, nodding. For now, she would stay. But the longer Vaughn waited, the closer the storm came. The sun sank low behind the mountains, and as the final patrol returned to the fortress, Lira felt it. A shift. The stillness that hung over the forest wasn't one of retreat. It was the quiet that came before the first strike. Kalen descended from the watchtower, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the far ridge. Darian met him at the base of the wall, tension rippling through his posture. They're gathering, Darian muttered. Kalen's jaw tightened. I know. Lira watched from the balcony above, her heart hammering against her ribs. The Ironfangs weren't waiting anymore. They were coming. Part 2, Fire on the Ridge. By nightfall, the forest came alive with movement. Lira stood at the northern wall, gripping the cold iron railing as torches flickered in the distance. Vaughn's wolves emerged from the shadows like ghosts, their eyes glinting in the pale moonlight. Kalen's wolves lined the wall beside her, weapons drawn and ready. Darian moved swiftly between the ranks, issuing quiet orders as the fortress prepared for the inevitable clash. Kalen stood at the gate, his sword resting easily in his hand. Lira stepped closer, her voice low. This is it, isn't it? She asked. Kalen's eyes never left the approaching wolves. Yes, he replied. Lira's breath caught. How many do you think he'll send? Kalen's gaze flicked toward her, calm but deadly. All of them. Lira swallowed hard, gripping the hilt of her father's blade. I'm ready, she whispered. Kalen's eyes softened, but he nodded. I know. The Ironfangs stopped just short of the fortress gates, Vaughn standing at the center of them. His eyes found Lira immediately, and he smiled. Shall we begin? Vaughn called, his voice smooth but laced with danger. Kalen stepped forward, his grip tightening on the sword at his side. No, Kalen replied, his voice cold as ice. We finish it. The moon hung heavy over the fortress, casting silver light over the wolves gathered at the gate. Lira's pulse thudded against her ribs, each beat echoing louder than the silence that had fallen across the courtyard. Vaughn's wolves stretched in both directions, their numbers multiplying beneath the shadows of the trees. Lira counted at least 30 of them. Probably more. Vaughn's figure stood in the center, draped in that signature dark cloak that seemed to ripple in the wind, though none stirred. His hands rested casually on the hilt of a curved blade at his hip, but his eyes, those sharp amber eyes, never left her. Lira shifted beneath his gaze, her grip tightening on the sword hanging at her side. He's staring at you? The words coiled like venom in her thoughts, but she forced them down, steadying her breath. Kalen stepped forward, placing himself between her and Vaughn's wolves, as if sensing her unease. His broad shoulders blocked Vaughn's view of her, but the tension hanging in the air didn't ease. You're wasting time, Kalen growled. His voice carried across the courtyard, sharp and commanding. State your reason for being here, Vaughn. A slow smile crept across Vaughn's face, barely visible beneath the shadows cast by the torches. I thought that was obvious, Vaughn said smoothly. His eyes flickered briefly to Lira, even with Kalen standing between them. Kalen's hand drifted toward the sword strapped to his waist. The faint scrape of steel against leather echoed as he drew it in one fluid motion. I don't play games, Kalen warned, his blade glinting beneath the moon. Vaughn chuckled softly. Oh, but that's exactly why I'm here. Lira tensed, watching as Vaughn stepped forward. I've let you keep her long enough, Vaughn continued. But now I'm here to collect what's mine. Darien, who had been pacing quietly behind Kalen, stiffened. His bow was already notched, arrow trained on Vaughn's chest. She doesn't belong to you, Darien snarled, his usual calm cracking like ice beneath the surface. Vaughn's wolves shifted, their hackles rising at the tension in Darien's voice. Kalen raised a hand, silently ordering his wolves to hold their ground. She belongs to no one, Kalen said coldly. And if you think you'll cross this gate, you're mistaken. Lira swallowed the lump in her throat, stepping forward to stand at Kalen's side. I'm not going anywhere, she said, lifting her chin despite the fear curling in her gut. For the briefest moment, Vaughn's eyes met hers. His smile faded. I expected more fire from you, Vaughn mused. Your father didn't hesitate to shed blood for what he believed in. Tell me, girl, do you believe in anything at all? Lira felt her heart twist. Her father's name carried weight, even now. But she wouldn't let Vaughn use it as a weapon. I believe you're wasting your breath, she replied, her grip tightening on the hilt of her sword. Vaughn's gaze narrowed, but before he could speak, Kalen stepped closer to the gate. This is your last chance to leave, Kalen said, his voice low but unyielding. Take your wolves and vanish into the dark, Vaughn, before I send you back in pieces. For a long moment, Vaughn didn't move. His eyes flickered between Kalen and Lira, calculating, weighing his options. Then slowly, Vaughn lifted his hand. Lyra's breath caught as Vaughn's wolves began to step back, melting into the shadows like smoke curling from a fire. But Vaughn lingered. His amber gaze met Kalen's one last time. This isn't over, Vaughn said softly. I'll return for her. And when I do, no wall will keep me out. Kalen's blade didn't lower. I'll be waiting, Kalen replied coldly. Vaughn smiled again, faint but dangerous. Then he turned, disappearing into the darkness as silently as he had come. The forest swallowed them whole, leaving nothing but the cold wind behind. The courtyard remained still long after Vaughn's wolves had gone. Lira leaned against the outer wall, exhaling as the tension finally drained from her body. He retreated, she said softly, watching the last traces of torchlight vanish beyond the trees. Kalen sheathed his blade, but didn't relax. His gaze lingered on the woods, as if expecting Vaughn to double back at any moment. Darien lowered his bow, sighing heavily as he stepped beside Lira. That wasn't a retreat, Darien muttered. He's circling. Lira frowned, glancing toward him. What do you mean? Darien's eyes darkened. He's probing the walls, Darien replied. He wanted to see how you'd react. Next time, he won't walk away without blood. Kalen nodded. Darien's right, Kalen said quietly. Vaughn didn't come to fight tonight. Lira swallowed hard. Then why come at all? She asked. Kalen's gaze shifted to her, and for the first time, she saw something other than confidence beneath his hardened exterior. He was worried. Because he wanted to see if you were afraid, Kalen replied. Lyra's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stay calm. And did he? Kalen's eyes narrowed, but he shook his head. No, he said quietly. He saw something else. Lira frowned, stepping closer. What did he see? Kalen met her gaze, his voice soft but certain. He saw that you're ready. Lira stiffened, unsure if that was a comfort or a warning. Darien chuckled softly, though there was no humor behind it. Well, he won't have to wonder much longer, Darien muttered. Because I don't think Vaughn will wait for an invitation. Kalen's gaze returned to the forest, his hand lingering on the hilt of his sword. No, Kalen agreed. He won't. Lira exhaled, feeling the weight of the night settle over her shoulders. She wasn't ready for war, but Vaughn wouldn't give her a choice. Chapter 15. The Breaking of the Pack. The cold lingered long after Vaughn's wolves had retreated, as if the air itself remembered his presence. Lira could feel it sinking into her bones as she walked the perimeter of the fortress, her hand brushing against the hilt of the sword at her side. Kalen's pack moved quietly along the walls, reinforcing weak points and watching the tree with the relentless focus of wolves expecting the storm to break at any moment. But the storm hadn't broken. Not yet. Darien approached from the far end of the wall, his footsteps soft despite the weight of his boots. "You're still awake," he said, stepping beside her. Lira didn't look away from the forest. "So are you?" Darien smirked faintly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Kalen's got half the pack on edge after tonight," Darien replied. "Hard to sleep when you're waiting for someone to slip a knife through the gate." Lira shifted her weight, brushing hair from her face as the wind tugged at her cloak. "Do you think Vaughn's already planning another attack?" she asked. Darien's smirk faded. "He's always planning," Darien said quietly. "But he won't strike again, without a reason. Wolves don't waste energy unless there's blood to be gained." Lira exhaled, gripping the cold stone of the fortress wall. "Then why do I feel like he's already inside these walls?" she muttered. Darien's gaze darkened. "Because he is," Darien replied. "Not in flesh, but in every shadow we check twice. In every wolf wondering whether you're worth the risk." Lyra's chest tightened. The truth stung more than she wanted to admit. Vaughn didn't need to climb the walls to tear the pack apart. His whispers were enough. Lira turned toward Darien, her voice quieter now. "Do they blame me for this?" Darien hesitated, running a hand through his hair, as if choosing his words carefully. "They fear what you represent," Darien replied. "You remind them of the rebellion, of the wolves who died for a war that didn't belong to them." Lira swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the stone. "They think I'm going to bring that war here," she whispered. Darien's gaze softened, though his tone remained firm.
"No," he said.
"They think Vaughn is going to bring it, and that you're the reason he'll come." Lira closed her eyes, exhaling slowly to steady the churning in her chest. "I never asked to be part of this," she said softly. Darien chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "Neither did the rest of us," he replied. "But here we are." The wind howled faintly beyond the fortress walls, curling through the trees like a distant echo of the wolves that waited in the dark. Lira opened her eyes, watching the shifting treeline below. "I don't want to run," she said. Darien met her gaze, his expression softening. "No one's asking you to," he replied. But the weight in his voice said otherwise. Kalen stood near the outer gate when Lira approached, his posture rigid as he watched the patrols returning from the far ridge. The firelight cast long shadows across his features, highlighting the sharpness of his expression. "Anything?" Lira asked, stepping beside him. Kalen's gaze didn't shift from the approaching wolves. "Nothing yet," he replied. Lira hesitated, searching his face for any trace of doubt. But Kalen was impossible to read, even now. "Vaughn's not gone," Lira said quietly. Kalen nodded. "I know." They stood in silence for a long moment, the faint crackle of the torches filling the space between them. Finally, Lira spoke again. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Holding this place, defending it against wolves who won't stop until they tear it apart." Kalen's gaze shifted, his eyes locking onto hers with sharp intensity. "Every day," he admitted. "But if I don't stand here, no one else will." Lira swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle deep into her chest. She didn't have the heart to tell him that she wasn't sure if she could stand beside him forever. But tonight she would. For now, that was enough. The next morning came with blood. Lira woke to the distant sound of shouting. She pulled herself from bed, the cold stone floor biting at her feet as she slipped into her boots and threw on her cloak. The shouts echoed louder as she reached the courtyard, where Kalen's wolves had gathered in a tight circle near the gate. Darien stood at the center of the group, his blade glinting beneath the early morning light. A wolf lay at his feet, blood pooling beneath the body and seeping into the cracks between the stones. Lira's stomach twisted. "Who is it?" she asked quietly, stepping beside Darien. He didn't look away from the corpse. "Jorek," Darien replied grimly. "One of Vaughn's." Kalen emerged from the fortress steps, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the body. "Where did you find him?" Kalen asked. Darien glanced toward the outer wall. "He was inside the gate," Darien replied. "Scouting." Lira's breath hitched. "He got through the gate?" Darien's expression darkened. "Someone let him in," he said. A cold silence swept through the courtyard, every wolf exchanging wary glances. Lyra's blood ran cold. Vaughn hadn't just sent wolves to circle the fortress. He had already planted one inside. Kalen's gaze swept over the gathered wolves, his voice cutting through the silence. "Search the grounds," Kalen ordered. "Find anyone who doesn't belong." The wolves dispersed quickly, leaving only Lira, Darian, and Kalen standing near Jorek's body. Lira knelt beside the corpse, her fingers brushing the faint crest etched into the hilt of Jorek's dagger. "This was a warning," Lira said quietly. Kalen's gaze flicked toward her. "I know," he replied. Darian's hand lingered on his bow, his eyes narrowing toward the forest beyond the wall. "This won't stop," Darian muttered. "Not until Vaughn's dead." Kalen's jaw tightened. "Then we kill him," Kalen said coldly. Lira looked up at him, her heart pounding. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if Kalen meant it as a promise or a threat. The sun crept higher over the fortress, but the warmth it brought did little to ease the cold settling in Lyra's chest. Vaughn had been inside the walls, whether through Jorek or another unseen hand, and the knowledge coiled tightly around her like a second skin. Kalen knelt beside Jorek's body, his eyes narrowing as he examined the wound. His blade had cut clean, but Lira could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of what this meant. "He shouldn't have made it this far," Kalen muttered, wiping the blood from his sword with slow precision. Lira hovered nearby, watching as the pack scattered to begin their search. Darian lingered at the edge of the courtyard, his bow slung across his back, but his fingers restless at his side. "You think he'd help?" Lira said quietly, crossing her arms to steady the faint tremble in her hands. Kalen didn't look up. "There's no other way he got through the gate," he replied. Lyra's stomach twisted. "And if Vaughn has someone else inside the fortress?" Kalen rose, his eyes meeting hers with cold certainty. "Then we find them," he said simply. "And we deal with them." Lira swallowed hard. "By deal with, I'm assuming you mean—" "Yes," Kalen cut in before she could finish. Lira exhaled, pressing her back against the stone wall to ground herself. "Not much room for mercy here, is there?" she muttered. Kalen stepped closer, his gaze sharp as it lingered on her face. "There's no room for mercy when it gets people killed," he said softly.
"You know that."
Lira stiffened, but she didn't look away. "I know," she admitted, "but it doesn't make it easier." Kalen's expression didn't change. "It's not supposed to." By midday, the fortress was alive with movement. The tension from Jorek's death spread like wildfire, tightening the wolves' patrols and driving them to check every corner of the stronghold for signs of betrayal. Lira spent most of the afternoon helping reinforce the southern gate, but her mind kept drifting back to the courtyard, the blood, the look on Kalen's face. She wasn't naive. Vaughn wouldn't let this rest. Jorek's infiltration wasn't just a probe. It was a message. "I can get inside. I already have." By evening, Lira found herself back along the upper wall, staring out over the forest as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Darian joined her again, leaning casually against the ledge. "You've been standing here for hours," he said, breaking the silence. "I needed space," Lira replied, brushing loose strands of hair from her face. Darian arched a brow. "Space isn't exactly safe right now," he said. Lyra's lips twitched faintly, though the humor didn't reach her eyes. "Not much is." Darian studied her quietly. "You're thinking about leaving," he said after a pause. Lyra's grip tightened on the stone. "I can't stay here forever, Darian," she admitted. "If I'm the reason Vaughn keeps pushing, maybe I shouldn't be in the middle of this." Darian frowned, shaking his head. "Running won't stop him," Darian replied. "If you leave, Vaughn will just follow. And Kalen won't let you walk into his hands alone." Lira exhaled sharply. "I know that," she said, lowering her gaze. "But part of me feels like I'm making this worse." Darian's gaze softened slightly. "You're not," he said. "Vaughn's coming whether you're here or not. This was always going to happen." Lira glanced at him, uncertainty flickering in her chest. "How can you be so sure?" she asked. Darian met her gaze, his expression grim. "Because Vaughn doesn't know how to stop," he replied. Nightfall crept over the fortress, with a heavy stillness. The torches burned low along the walls, casting faint flickers of light over the stone. Lira stood in the courtyard with Kalen, watching as the last of the patrols filed in through the gate. They found nothing, Kalen said, his tone clipped. Lira crossed her arms. You don't believe that's the end of it, she guessed. Kalen's gaze lingered on the tree beyond the walls. No, he admitted. Vaughn's watching. Waiting. And he'll keep waiting until we make the first move. Lira shifted beside him, the weight of her sword pressing heavily against her hip. Then maybe it's time we stopped waiting, she said quietly. Kalen glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. You think we should take the fight to him? Lira hesitated, but the fire simmering beneath her skin spoke louder than her doubts. I think Vaughn already believes he's in control, she replied. Maybe it's time we reminded him that this isn't his land. A faint flicker of approval crossed Kalen's face, but it disappeared just as quickly. You're not wrong, Kalen said. But Vaughn expects that. If we push too early, we could lose more than we gain. Lira frowned, brushing her thumb along the edge of her blade's hilt. And if we do nothing? Kalen's jaw tightened. Then he wins without ever crossing the gate. Lira exhaled, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on both of them. She didn't have an answer. But neither did Kalen. For now, the only thing standing between them and Vaughn was the fortress wall, and the thin line of wolves guarding it. The first arrow fell just before dawn. Lira woke to the faint thud of something striking the outer wall, her eyes snapping open as distant howls echoed beyond the gate. She threw on her cloak, grabbing her sword as she stumbled from her chamber. The courtyard was already alive with movement by the time she arrived. Wolves lined the upper wall, bows raised and swords drawn as shadows flickered in the trees beyond the border. Kalen stood at the gate, his sword glinting beneath the rising sun. Vaughn's wolves had come. Lira's pulse pounded as she reached Kalen's side. How many? She asked, her breath misting in the cold. Kalen's gaze hardened as he watched the figures gathering in the tree. All of them, he replied. Lira's fingers tightened around her sword, the cold metal humming beneath her touch. She had known this moment would come, but knowing didn't make it easier. They'll break against the walls, Kalen growled. We hold the line here. Lira nodded, swallowing the fear rising in her throat. This was it. The wolves were at their door. And this time, Vaughn wasn't leaving without blood. As dawn broke over the fortress, Lira stood atop the northern wall, watching the last shadows of Vaughn's retreat vanish into the dense forest. The cold wind carried the weight of promises unfulfilled, and though the battle was over, she knew it wasn't victory. Only a brief pause before the storm returned. Kalen stood beside her, silent but watchful, his presence as steady as the stone beneath their feet. Vaughn's eyes had lingered on her through the smoke and blood, a warning she couldn't shake. Lira tightened her grip on the hilt of her sword, the weight of her father's blade a constant reminder of the path she had chosen. She wasn't the same woman who had arrived at the fortress's gates, fragile and uncertain. When Vaughn returned, and she knew he would, she wouldn't hide behind Kalen's strength. She would stand at his side, blade drawn, ready to carve out her place in the pack or die defending it. The wolves had retreated, but their howls still echoed in her bones. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The end. Thank you so much for listening to our audiobook. The Alpha's captive heart lays the foundation for Lira's transformation from an outsider to a force capable of defending the pack. But the shadows cast by Vaughn's retreat linger, and the fragile peace won't hold for long. In the Alpha's shadow rising, alliances will be tested, and new enemies will emerge, not all of them from beyond the fortress walls. As Vaughn's relentless pursuit threatens to unravel the pack, Lira will be forced to confront the darkness growing within her own ranks. The fight for survival is far from over, and when the wolves return, the question won't be whether the fortress can withstand the siege, but whether the pack itself will survive the coming storm. Watch out for Book 2, The Alpha's Shadow Rising.